Hey guys, tonight we are heading back into the frosted streets of Tsarist Russia, a world wrapped in silence, ice and 1,000 whispered secrets. You're about to walk a mile in some heavy boots, and a life you probably wouldn't survive. Because here's the thing, history can be romantic from a distance, but when you zoom in close past the snow-covered cathedrals and candlelit palaces, past the lacquered carriages and fur-lined nobility, you find the stories that never made it into the gilded portraits. Stories of survival, shame and systems too big to fight. And tonight, we're not drifting through ballrooms. We're slipping into alleyways and upstairs rooms, exploring the dark truth of prostitution in the Russian Empire. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, what time is it where you are? And what city are you listening from? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's winter, always winter here. Or at least it feels that way. The cobblestones are icy underfoot, your breath fogs in the still night air, and gas lamps flicker along Nevsky Prospect, the main artery of Saint Petersburg. The year? Let's say 1892, though honestly, you could pick nearly any point in the late 19th century and land in the same scene. Around you, carriages rattle past, and fur-wrapped aristocrats hustle from opera houses to private clubs, but you're not with them. You're slipping down a narrow street off the main avenue, ducking beneath an archway. The cold air here tastes of soot, urine and snow. You're heading into a part of the city that doesn't appear on tourist maps, if those even existed yet. This is a world of unlit stairwells, peeling plaster and doors that creak open into rooms lit by oil lamps and filled with silence, or muffled sound. If you listen closely you can hear laughter, though not the joyful kind, the brittle kind that comes from people playing roles they can't afford to stop playing. Here, in the shadows of imperial wealth, prostitution isn't just a thing that happens, it's an institution, a regulated, documented, and very publicly ignored feature of daily life. You might think of brothels as secret places, tucked away from respectable society. Not here. In Tsarist Russia, prostitution was legal, organised, and most darkly under government oversight. The same government that promoted orthodox Christian values and punished moral deviation was also issuing permits to brothel owners and ID cards to sex workers. It was called reglementation, and it worked like a grim clockwork machine. Let's say you're a woman arriving in Saint Petersburg from a rural village. You've been promised work, maybe as a maid, maybe as a laundress. But when you arrive, there's no job waiting, just a landlord demanding rent, and a stomach that won't stop growling. Eventually you hear whispers. Someone tells you about the yellow ticket. Ah, yes, the yellow ticket. A slip of paper that changes your entire identity. If you apply for it, you are officially a prostitute in the eyes of the empire. You're given a booklet, your name and address are recorded, and your body now legally belongs to two things, your madam and the Russian state. And from that point on, you're no longer a person. You're a number in a registry, with weekly medical inspections and the permanent label of fallen woman. Here's the twist. Once you get that yellow ticket, there's no going back. It doesn't matter if you try to leave, marry or reinvent yourself. That classification follows you everywhere. You're barred from most employment, your passport is revoked, and your family, if they ever find out, might disown you entirely. Even the church, in many cases, won't receive you back. But the strangest part? The sheer normalcy of it all. These women are everywhere. There are over 1,000 registered prostitutes in St. Petersburg alone by the 1880s, and many more unregistered. Some work in state-monitored brothels, some in private apartments, and others, well, they drift through taverns, streets, and train stations. The system is massive, and it's built not just for control, but for visibility. Every district police officer knows where the brothels are. Every doctor knows when inspections are due. But society looks the other way, or rather, it looks selectively. The empire justifies the system as a way to protect public health and keep good women safe from temptation. Men, especially soldiers, students and bureaucrats, are expected to seek their pleasures, but not to bring disease home to wives. And so the state quietly nods along while simultaneously clutching its pearls. Want something fringe? Here you go. Some brothels in St. Petersburg were disguised as tea houses. Elegant salons where men sipped samovars of hot tea while choosing a companion for the evening. They were decorated to match the tastes of the upper class, complete with velvet curtains and delicate porcelain. The entire facade was absurd, an elaborate wink at the hypocrisy of it all. And of course, the scholars can't agree on whether the system helped or harmed. Some argue that reglementation at least gave these women medical attention and legal standing, however oppressive. Others point out that it institutionalized exploitation and left thousands trapped in cycles of poverty and abuse, without ever addressing the causes that pushed them into the trade to begin with. You duck into one of these tea houses, and you feel the heat hit you like a wall. Candles flicker, the scent of cheap perfume mingles with coal smoke, and music plays faintly from a scratched phonograph in the corner. A woman, probably no older than you, meets your eyes with a practiced smile. You nod. She nods, and for a moment there's a flicker of real recognition, like two people seeing past the roles they've been forced to play. Outside, the snow keeps falling, soft, steady, endless. She carries it tucked in the folds of her coat like a curse. You notice it peeking out, a pale yellow booklet, brittle at the corners, stamped and numbered by the Tsar's own bureaucracy. That little rectangle of paper tells everyone exactly who she is, and more importantly, what she's allowed to be. She's what the Empire calls a gentstachena sceltim billetum, a woman with a yellow ticket, not a citizen, not a daughter, not a wife, just a number in a ledger, a cautionary tale walking the streets. The yellow ticket isn't just a license, it's a brand. And the moment she accepted it, everything about her life shifted. You watch her move through the snow with a practiced gait. Head down but not slouched, eyes alert but never challenging. Every step says, don't ask questions, don't look too long. She's walking the invisible line between legality and shame in a city that watches everything and admits nothing. By the late 19th century, Russia's reglementation system had evolved into a rigid structure that aimed to manage vice without appearing to condone it. Women who found themselves with no other means of survival could voluntarily, or under duress, register with local authorities. Once they did, they were issued the yellow booklet, required to submit to weekly medical exams, and restricted in their movement. The state claimed it was for public health, but the truth was uglier. It was control, pure and simple. You picture it now, a line of women, some barely old enough to have left childhood behind, waiting outside a small government office tucked between a bakery and a pawn shop. A flickering oil lamp overhead casts shadows across their faces. Each woman holds a scrap of paper with her name, place of origin, and the reason she's unsuitable for respectable work. And then, when her turn comes, she steps forward, signs a form she doesn't fully understand, and receives the ticket. That's it. No second chances, no escape hatch. Once registered, she's on the books forever. Here's the sick irony. While the state wanted her to be visible for regulation, society wanted her invisible for comfort. The yellow ticket was a scarlet letter and a legal shield all at once. If she was arrested for loitering, she could show her booklet and be released. But if she wanted to work as a seamstress or domestic servant, denied. Want to marry? Denied. Some men did marry these women of course, but only unofficially, or with documents forged and backdated. Legally, they remained what the system declared them, fallen, unclean, forever other. And it gets darker. Many of the women you see with yellow tickets didn't sign up willingly. Traffickers, yes, that word absolutely applies, roamed the countryside, luring girls with promises of jobs in the city. Nannies, cooks, laundresses, sometimes even fake marriage proposals, and once they arrived, they were either tricked or forced into brothels, and when escape proved impossible, registration was the only option that kept them out of jail. There's a story you hear whispered in the corridors of Saint Petersburg's police archive about a girl named Katya. She came from a small village near Kazan. At 16, she was told she'd be working in a dressmaker's shop. Her family gave her their last few rubles for the journey. When she arrived, the address she was given led to a brothel. She tried to run. They found her 2 days later, freezing and starving in a railway station. The police gave her a choice, yellow ticket or prison. She chose the booklet. What happened after that? No one knows for sure. The file ends there. But her name remains buried in an old registry. Number 4127. A strange fact? There were underground forgers who specialised in removing yellow ticket status. For the right price, they could alter documents, even bribe certain officials to lose your registration. Of course, this kind of backdoor redemption cost more than most women could ever afford, and if you were caught, re-registration, public shaming, sometimes even imprisonment. The risk was immense, but for some it was worth it. You're walking past a station house now, and you see a group of women being herded inside by 2 policemen. They're quiet, shivering slightly, some still clutching their coats around them. One of them meets your eyes. Her gaze is empty, not because she's weak, but because she's learned that emotion gets you nowhere in these moments. Inside, she'll strip down for a doctor who checks her body like livestock. Every Friday, like clockwork, she has no right to refuse, and if she's found to have any signs of venereal disease, she'll be confined in a special hospital marked as unclean and likely dismissed from her brothel without pay, without care, without recourse. The medical exams, by the way, were rarely hygienic or respectful. Conducted quickly, often with used instruments, in overcrowded, unsanitary rooms, they were more about bureaucracy than actual care. Records were filled out with cold detachment, and many doctors saw their patients as little more than vectors of infection. No one asked why these women got sick, no one cared if they were abused, only the results mattered, negative or positive, clean or dirty. And here's where scholars argue. Some say the system, broken as it was, at least provided a measure of consistency, better than what existed in France or Britain at the time, they claim. Others argue that the Russian model was especially cruel, precisely because it cloaked its brutality in medical and moral language. It gave people the illusion that something was being done, when in reality the system just kept churning, unaffected by individual suffering. One thing's certain, the yellow ticket didn't protect these women. It boxed them in. It allowed them to survive, but only within boundaries so tight, so cold that any spark of joy or hope had to be carefully hidden. You glance back at the woman you saw earlier, disappearing into a side alley. Her face vanishes into shadow, and for a second, you wonder what her name was, but like most people around you, you'll never ask. The city swallows her whole. There's a brass plate screwed into the doorframe, so tarnished dead by winter air and damp fingers that you almost miss it. Just a number, no name, no sign, but locals know what it means. Behind this door is one of the many state-sanctioned brothels in Saint Petersburg. Not a criminal den, not a secret, an officially recognised business, inspected, licensed, taxed. You knock once, and the door swings open. Inside, warmth floods out like breath from a sleeping beast. The woman at the door doesn't look surprised. She gives you the once-over, measuring you like an object, and steps aside. You enter into a parlour dimly lit by flickering gas lamps and covered in red velvet curtains that never get washed. The carpet muffles your footsteps, and the air smells faintly of body powder, old smoke, and something sour beneath it. Somewhere in the back, a piano plinks out a tired waltz. This is one of the cleaner brothels meant for mid-tier clientele, clerks, military officers, travelling merchants, nothing too extravagant. But not the worst either. Welcome to the world of the state-sanctioned brothel. They exist in nearly every major Russian city by the late 1800s. In St. Petersburg alone, there are hundreds, some openly labelled, others hiding behind euphemisms like women's boarding house or entertainment parlour. All are approved by the local police. All are listed in ledgers, and all are part of a state machine that has decided it's easier to regulate vice than to eliminate it. Each brothel is overseen by a madam, or hozyaika, who manages everything from the daily schedule to the bribes handed to officials. Some of them are former sex workers themselves, women who aged out of the system and saw management as their only upward mobility. Others are simply savvy businesswomen who found opportunity in the empire's moral grey zones. They are feared and respected in equal measure, tough, sharp, and well aware of how to manipulate paperwork and people alike. There are rules here, lots of them. Rooms must be inspected regularly. Clean linens must be provided, though how clean is defined varies wildly. No alcohol is to be served officially, although vodka flows like tap water behind the scenes. Most importantly, every woman must show proof of her latest medical inspection. If she's behind on appointments, she's fined. If she's sick, she's out, no matter the circumstance. Peculiar fact, brothels were divided into classes. You had first-class establishments, elegant, with chandeliers and silk sheets. These were rare and reserved for the wealthiest clients, men who didn't want to rub shoulders with the common folk while indulging. Then there were second and third-class brothels, more functional than luxurious. And finally, the lowest tier, state-run dormitory-style brothels where women shared rooms and clients cycled in like train passengers. No privacy, no music, no velvet curtains, just the daily churn of a desperation. You hear footsteps above. A door opens, followed by the quiet conversation. A man descends the stairs, adjusting his coat. He looks like a junior officer, young, freshly shaven, reeking of aftershave and borrowed arrogance. He nods at the madam, who marks something in a ledger. She doesn't smile. Just records the visit and waves him out. Efficiency over elegance. This system survives on silence. The state pretends it exists only for public health. The police pretend to enforce the rules while pocketing bribes. The brothel owners pretend to follow regulations while padding their earnings. And society pretends it doesn't see the streams of men entering and exiting these buildings every day, every night. You climb the narrow staircase, steep and creaking, and pass rooms with closed doors. Behind one, you hear soft laughter. Behind another, a woman's voice raised in irritation, quickly hushed. The hallway smells like sweat and cologne and winter coats that have never been washed. A young woman stands near the stairwell, adjusting her hair in a cracked mirror. She catches your eye in the glass, but doesn't turn around. There's something fictionized about this place. Each woman plays a part. She smiles when required, moves when signalled, disappears when dismissed. Her body is not her own. It's part of a process, regulated, itemized, inspected. But her spirit? That's harder to contain. You notice it in the smallest details. The way she tucks her hair behind her ear after a client leaves. The way her fingers curl into fists for just a second before she puts on her smile again. Historians still debate the nature of this regulation. Some say that by legalizing brothels, the Russian Empire offered women a degree of protection, however minimal, from street violence, disease, or complete destitution. Others argue, convincingly, that it institutionalized misogyny, embedding it into law and calling it morality. The state wasn't protecting women, it was protecting the reputation of men. Soldiers needed to be relieved, bureaucrats needed release, and the state needed to pretend this was all normal. And then there were the rules about silence. Women were forbidden to shout, argue, or be seen outside their place of work unless specifically permitted. If they were caught talking to a man in public without proper documentation, they risked arrest, even if he was a client. The power imbalance was staggering. You could be legally bought, inspected and discarded, but not speak freely in the street. One particularly strange policy? In some cities, brothels were forbidden from operating within a certain distance of churches, schools, and government buildings. But that distance shrank every year, especially if the right palms were greased. By 1900, brothels existed a stone's throw from ministry offices and military barracks. It was an open secret, a ballet of denial performed in broad daylight. You make your way back downstairs. The madame is seated behind a low desk, thumbing through bills and small coins. Her eyes flick them up as you pass. Not suspicious, just cataloguing. She does this with everyone. She's learned not to trust faces, only behaviour. Outside, the snow is falling harder now, thick and heavy. The sky glows with city light, casting halos around the lampposts. Before you leave, you glance back through the frosted glass. A girl in a green shawl is laughing with another in the corner, sharing a cigarette between them. It's not joyful laughter exactly, but it's not empty either. It's the sound of two people making space for a sliver of humanity in a place that was designed to crush it. And then the door closes. The waiting room is warm, but you don't feel any comfort in it. The stove hums low in the corner, casting flickering orange against the peeling wallpaper. A few chairs line the wall, their wood worn to a shine from countless anxious bodies. It smells like antiseptic, burnt coal and something sharper, something sour and metallic you can't quite name. You're not in a brothel now, you're in a government medical office, and if you're holding a yellow ticket, you know exactly what comes next. This is where the state pulls off its grand illusion, pretending that its concern is public health, when what it really wants is public order. Every registered sex worker is required to show up here once a week, no excuses. You get a slip of paper with the date and time. Miss it and you're fined, or worse, locked up in the women's detention hospital until someone decides you're no longer a threat. So you come, week after week, and wait your turn like cattle in a bureaucratic slaughterhouse. You glance around at the other women. One is biting the inside of her cheek, trying not to look nervous. Another stares at the floor, arms crossed tight around herself, her knuckles white. The older ones have the stillness of people who've done this too many times to count. They've learned to go somewhere else in their minds when the exam begins. You envy that numbness, even though you know what it cost. The door creaks open. A nurse calls her name, flat and disinterested. The woman stands and walks inside. The door shuts again. No one talks. That's the rule. Silence in the waiting room. Everyone pretends they're not here. The doctor is usually a man. Not always, but often enough that the exam feels like something other than medicine. He doesn't greet you. Doesn't ask your name, just gestures to the metal table and snaps on gloves that look suspiciously reused. He checks for signs of infection, quickly, roughly, with no gentleness. He might scribble a note in a little black notebook, mutter something to the nurse and wave you out. Sometimes he'll pause, glance at you as if assessing a piece of fruit for rot, then return to his writing. No words, no eye contact, you dress as quickly as possible. Your body feels alien, Deis, violated by indifference more than by touch. On the way out, the nurse hands you a stamped slip, proof that you're clean for the week. It's the only thing that lets you keep working. Without it, you're unemployable, even in a brothel. The madam won't risk a fine, no one will. Here's a fact that makes your stomach turn. The Russian Empire had over 100 such clinics by the early 1900s, each churning through dozens, sometimes hundreds of women a day. The goal wasn't treatment, it was classification. If a woman tested positive for syphilis or gonorrhea, she was sent to a venereal hospital for quarantine. Treatment was painful, crude and humiliating. Mercury rubs, arsenic drinks, no anaesthetic, no privacy, just punishment masquerading as medicine. And the kicker? There was no equivalent system for men, none. They could visit any number of women, carry any number of diseases, and never once be examined. The entire burden of the empire's sexual hygiene fell on women, specifically on the women society had already cast aside. If that feels rigged, it's because it absolutely was. You hear rumours, always whispered, about doctors who abused their power, who demanded favours in exchange for clean certificates. No one reports them. Who would believe a woman with a yellow ticket over a state-sanctioned medical officer? The power imbalance is baked in. Even if you try to speak out, the complaint gets lost in a drawer somewhere, or worse, it draws attention to you, and attention is dangerous. One woman, according to an old court file buried in the archives, tried to sue a clinic doctor for assault during an inspection. Her case was dismissed before it reached a judge. The official explanation was lack of credible witness. Her yellow ticket was cited as evidence that she was morally compromised. The doctor continued practicing. She disappeared from the records entirely a few months later. Whether she left the city, died, or was sent to a reform institution, no one knows. Some scholars now debate whether the clinic served any public health purpose at all. Disease still spread, often rapidly, especially in military barracks and factories. Medical supplies were inconsistent, diagnostics were primitive, and follow-up was non-existent. The weekly checkups were more ritual than remedy, but they gave the illusion of control. And in a sprawling empire teetering on revolution, illusion was everything. Still, there were exceptions. A few progressive doctors tried to treat their patients with dignity. One woman's diary, recovered from a box of mouldy letters in a former brothel-turned-museum, mentions a clinic in Odessa where the staff offered blankets, tea, even basic education in anatomy and hygiene. But that place was rare, a quiet rebellion against the system. And it didn't last long. You step out of the clinic and feel the cold bite through your coat. The line outside is still growing. Snow falls in thick, wet clumps, sticking to eyelashes and coat shoulders. A police officer stands on the corner, watching but not helping. His job is to make sure the women don't loiter, don't talk, don't gather in groups larger than 3. That's another rule, you realise. Even sickness can't justify solidarity. As you walk away, you notice a small chalk mark near the base of a wall, barely visible beneath the grime. Just a circle with a cross inside, a symbol used by some brothel workers to signal that a friendly clinic worker is on shift that day. A whisper of kindness in a city where kindness feels like contraband. You think again of the exam table, the silence, the stamp, the powerlessness. You wonder how many women pass through that room before you. How many more will follow? And you pass under another archway, darker this time, narrower with broken cobblestones underfoot. The gas lamps don't reach this part of the city, not really. Shadows lean heavy against crumbling walls. Here, in the unregistered zones, everything feels more raw. You feel it in the air. Quieter, yes, but not safer. This is the world of the streetwalker. The women who either never got their yellow ticket, or tore it up a long time ago. Out here, there's no velvet curtain. No madame writing in a ledger. No weekly health inspection. Just alleyways, taverns, and quick transactions in corners no one claims. These women are ghosts in the eyes of the state, illegal, invisible, and everywhere. They move fast, keep their heads down, and know every back entrance, every gap in the fence, every cop who's more interested in favours than fines. and they work with a constant awareness that any wrong move might get them arrested, or worse. You see one now, leaning against the side of a bakery closed for the night. She's pretending to smoke, eyes scanning the street, coat buttoned all the way to her throat. She's maybe 20, maybe younger. She makes eye contact with a man walking past, holds it just long enough, then glances toward a nearby alley. A silent negotiation. He hesitates, follows. This is how it happens. Fast, quiet, practiced. No names, no greetings, a transaction in the snow. Out here, desperation has different rules. Some women turn to street work after being kicked out of brothels. Sick, too old, too troublesome. Others never had the choice. Maybe they couldn't afford to register. Maybe they were runaways, orphans, or too frightened to set foot in a police office. And some, maybe the bravest, maybe the most stubborn, refused on principle. They didn't want to be numbered, tracked, examined like livestock. So they chose freedom in the margins, even if it came with twice the danger. And the danger is constant. Streetwalkers are prey to everything. Violence from clients, raids by police, even attacks from brothel workers protecting their turf. Rape, robbery, and abuse are not just risks, they're expected. If something happens to a woman out here, no one comes running, no one opens a case file. If her body turns up in the canal, she's just another vagrant. Buried in a pauper's grave, maybe not buried at all. You hear stories whispered through the brickwork. Like the one about the boyars, a group of bored aristocrats in Moscow who were known to cruise the slums looking for unregistered girls to hunt. Yes, hunt. They'd lure them with coin, then turn violent, sometimes sadistic, knowing full well that no one would come looking. Once they left a girl barely alive outside a bathhouse. The matron who found her tried to report the crime. She was arrested for slander. The boyars were never even named in the papers. And yet somehow, these women endure. They form loose networks, word-of-mouth safety nets. One warns the others if a client turns violent. Another shares a half loaf of bread she got from a sympathetic baker. There are safe spots too, underground cellars, sympathetic landlords, a back room in a tavern where the barkeep doesn't ask questions. It's not a community in the soft glowing sense, it's a survival mechanism, and it's all they have. An odd little quirk. Some streetwalkers develop coded languages. Not just slang, but full dialects, half real, half invented. A mix of Russian, Yiddish, Polish and sheer nonsense using to speak in front of police without being understood. A kind of protection. A way to maintain control over the few things they still owned. Their words, their names, their stories. You hear it in passing, snippets that don't make sense until you realise they were never meant to. You duck into a tavern that smells like vinegar and boiled potatoes. It's crowded tonight. A mix of dock workers, tailors, factory men, most of them young, many already drunk. In the far corner, two women sit at a table, one with her feet tucked beneath her, the other watching the door. They're not here to drink. They're waiting. You know that look. The patient calculation of someone working 2 steps ahead of whatever's coming through that door next. This world isn't just about sex, it's about hunger, rent, cold. Every night these women make calculations. Is this the night I get lucky? Oh. Is this the night I don't come back? For many, street work is a last resort, but one that never ends. Once you're here, climbing back out is nearly impossible. There's no savings, no retirement, just aging out, injuries, or something worse. Even the brothel workers talk about the streets with dread. It's where you go when no one else will take you. It's the unlit end of the line. Scholars argue, always from a safe distance, about whether unregulated prostitution in Imperial Russia offered any kind of agency. Some claim that women who rejected state registration were asserting a kind of autonomy. Others argue they were just avoiding a slower kind of death. But either way, this underground world existed outside the Empire's rigid moral codes, and that made it terrifying for those in power. Police would stage crackdowns every few months, arresting dozens of women, parading them through the streets, locking them in overcrowded jails. But it never lasted. Within weeks, the same women would return or be replaced by others. You can't arrest desperation. You can only move it around. There's a myth about a woman named Vera who worked the streets near a Saint Petersburg textile factory. According to the story, she carried a knife under her corset and once fought off 2 drunk soldiers in the snow with nothing but a broken bottle. No one knows if she was real, but every woman in that neighbourhood claimed to know her. She was more than a legend, she was a symbol. A reminder that not every woman on the street was helpless. Some were ferocious, furious, unforgettable. You walk back out into the snow. The woman by the bakery is gone. The alley is quiet. Somewhere nearby you hear the clatter of horse hooves and the distant call of a night watchman. The city keeps turning, oblivious. The Empire pretends these women don't exist, but they do. They always have, and they're still here, just out of sight. The snow muffles everything tonight, as if the whole city is trying to forget itself. You walk past rows of tenement houses, where oil lamps glow behind frosted glass. Each window a little stage for someone else's story. But behind some of those panes, the lives playing out are shaped by a cruel and silent equation, one in which a woman can be either a wife or a prostitute, but never both, never anything in between. This is one of the grimmer truths baked into the moral fabric of the Russian Empire. Respectability for women wasn't earned, it was assigned, and once lost it was almost never regained. You could be a seamstress, a housemaid, a teacher, a merchant's daughter. But if you stepped outside the rigid bounds of honourable femininity, you fell, and the Empire had 1,000 ways of letting you know you were never climbing back up. Marriage, in theory, was supposed to protect women. It gave them a title, wife, and a role, caretaker, mother, moral centre of the household, but it also locked them into dependence. A married woman couldn't own property independently. She couldn't file legal complaints without her husband's permission. If he was violent, she was expected to endure. If he disappeared, she became legally invisible. And if she tried to leave, society treated her the same as if she had sold her body in the street. The line between respectable and ruined was paper thin. Now imagine a woman who ends up with a yellow ticket. Whether she chose it or it was forced upon her, she's now marked. Even if she leaves the brothel, even if she tries to start over. That ticket, either literal or symbolic, ends with her. Landlords won't rent to her, churches won't marry her, schools won't employ her. The fallen woman is not a category. She's a sentence. You pass a church now, an old one. With smoke curling from the dome, the bells frozen silent. You see a woman step through the side door, scarf wrapped tightly around her face, holding a small candle. She lingers just inside the narthex, head bowed, before slipping back out into the snow. You can guess why she didn't stay. The Orthodox Church officially opposed prostitution, of course, but in practice it rarely acknowledged the women trapped in it. They weren't welcome among the faithful unless they were ready to disappear entirely, to enter a convent, perhaps, or vanish into charitable silence. That's the path some women were offered. Redemption through erasure. A few well-funded religious charities offered reform homes, where sex workers could supposedly be rehabilitated into domestic roles, laundresses, nannies, or cooks. But these homes were more prison than sanctuary. Confession, obedience, silence. That was the price of forgiveness, and many didn't make it past the gates. One memoir from a reformer described women arriving at the doorstep so starved and broken they died within days. Their bodies were buried quietly, their names never written down. Meanwhile, respectable women, wives, daughters, debutantes, were held up as symbols of purity. Their education focused not on knowledge, but on behaviour. How to sew, how to curtsy, how to keep their voices soft. Sex was never mentioned, even in marriage preparation. Ignorance was considered protection, and if they failed to live up to these expectations, the fall was swift. A rumour, a letter, an unchaperoned walk with the wrong man. Any of it could exile a woman from her social circle permanently. There's a fringe story that circulated among literary circles in Moscow. A nobleman's daughter supposedly fell in love with her family's coachman. When their relationship was discovered, she was sent to a convent in the Urals. He was conscripted into the army and never heard from again. Years later, she escaped, travelled to Saint Petersburg, and began working in a brothel under a false name. They say she refused the yellow ticket, operated independently, and used her income to write anonymous essays criticising the empire's morality laws. Some even claim she met Tolstoy. True or not, her legend is whispered like a ghost story, equal parts tragedy and rebellion. And then there's the matter of children, because yes, many of these women had them. Children born in brothels, raised in tenements, or sent to orphanages the moment they could walk. A registered sex worker couldn't legally marry, but she could still become a mother, and the state didn't quite know what to do with that. If the child was lucky, maybe a relative claimed them. If not, they were cast into the system, wards of the state, growing up with the same stigma stamped onto their backs. Some women tried to hide their children entirely, placing them with wet nurses or boarding homes. But the costs piled up quickly, and soon enough they'd be forced to choose, feed themselves or feed their child. There are heart-wrenching letters in the police archives, pleas from mothers begging to keep their babies out of state custody, even as they offered their own labour for free in exchange. Most of those letters went unanswered. You wander through a quieter neighbourhood now, lined with snow-covered balconies and shuttered shops. There's a warmth in the windows, a softness in the flickering lamplight that feels just out of reach. Behind one curtain, a man reads aloud to his wife while she knits, a picture of domestic bliss. You wonder, how many women watching from the street once dreamed of something like that? How many still do? The empire wanted its women to fit into neat categories, pure or impure, wife or whore, virgin or cautionary tale. But real life, as you're starting to see, never fits into such clean boxes. There were brothel workers who loved fiercely, wives who hid bruises beneath lace, mothers who sold themselves for their child's bread, and women who simply wanted to survive in a world that offered them no choices that weren't already poisoned. The snow starts falling harder again, tapping against the brim of your hat. You pause under a street lamp, watching flakes swirl through the golden light. The quiet here feels deeper, almost holy, and in the silence, you realise that the Empire's darkest cruelty wasn't in what it did to women's bodies. It was in what it took from their names, their futures, their ability to ever be seen as whole again. You turn your collar up against the cold and keep walking. Somewhere a bell tolls faintly in the distance. One, then another. A city full of judgments ringing out into the night. Your boots crunch over frozen slush as you move deeper into the city's veins, where the lights flicker dimmer and the buildings lean in too close, as if they're hiding something they don't want you to see, and they are. Every block here has secrets, and tonight you're tracing the quiet path of one of the most invisible tragedies of the Russian Empire. The pipeline of peasant girls fed from rural villages into the jaws of urban brothels. It starts in the countryside, always. A village on the edge of nowhere, a wooden hut with a sagging roof, a cow that hasn't produced milk in a month, a father with too many debts and not enough sons. You imagine a girl named Daria, 14 years old, with calloused hands and frostbitten knuckles, spinning wool beside her mother, while the wind howls through the thatched cracks of their home. She dreams about Saint Petersburg. She's never seen it, but she's heard stories, told by men passing through, by cousins who wrote letters back before they vanished entirely. Glittering buildings, dancing gas lamps, music in every cafe. In her mind it glows, so when a stranger arrives in the village, dressed in a long coat with polished boots and soft words, and offers her a job as a housemaid in the capital. With real wages, he says, enough to send money home. It's not hard to imagine what she says. She says, yes. Her parents are hesitant, but he gives them a small advance. It's more than they've seen in months. They shake his hand. The stranger leaves with their daughter the next morning. Sure, she doesn't make it to a housemaid job, not even close. The train ride is long and cold. The man sits beside her the whole time, cheerful but firm, watching. In the city, everything is overwhelming. Steel tracks, endless buildings, people moving faster than she thought possible. And then she's taken to a building with locked doors, dim lighting, and a madam who looks her over like a slab of meat. That night, the clothes she arrived in are taken away. Her name too. Maybe she's renamed Anya or Katinka, something that rolls easier off the tongue. No papers, no wages, just a locked room, and a promise that if she runs, no one will help her. That if she goes to the police, they'll laugh, or worse. Trafficking wasn't some rare anomaly in the Russian Empire. It was an industry, a network. Recruiters worked with brothels, sometimes even directly with local police, to bring in a steady supply of girls. Some were abducted, others tricked, and some, like Daria, came willingly, until they realised what they'd really agreed to. By the late 1800s, entire rings operated along the railway lines, moving girls like cattle from one station to the next. There were holding houses, false employment offices, even forged contracts signed in rural dialects the girls couldn't read. One particularly cold case. A report filed in 1897 from the city of Oriol details the arrest of 2 men who had transported more than 25 girls over a 6-month span. They claimed the girls had been hired as dancers. None of them spoke a word when they were found. Most were under 16. Their names weren't even recorded. The file ends with a note. girls transferred to the care of the local hospital. What happened after that, the record doesn't say. Some of the girls ended up in state-regulated brothels and forced to register under threat of imprisonment. Others were funneled into illegal dens run by private pimps and madams with no connections to official channels. The worst off were kept in locked rooms, made to work for food, stripped of any chance to leave. They were property, plain and simple, and the system had no interest in their escape. And this is where the scholarly debate gets messier. Some argue that the state's regulation system, however flawed, was at least an attempt to protect these girls once they surfaced in the city. That once they registered, they had access to basic medical care and were somewhat shielded from violence. But others, and frankly more convincingly, point out that this only legitimized the exploitation. The state didn't rescue trafficked girls. It absorbed them, sanitized their stories with a stamp and a booklet and said, "Now you're legal," as if that made the trauma disappear. You pass a tenement with a faded sign above the door, barely legible, "Rooming for young ladies." It's a lie. These places often acted as first stops for rural girls, halfway houses between the village and the brothel. 1 or 2 nights spent in a back room sharing a mattress with strangers before the real placement happened. And if a girl resisted, the consequences were swift and brutal. Beatings, forced drugging, starvation. There are unverified accounts of girls being locked in dark cellars until they broke. No one was counting bodies in those basements. But the quietest tragedy? How easy it was for families to forget them. Letters stopped coming. Sometimes they never arrived in the first place. Parents assumed the worst or didn't want to know. Social stigma ran deep. A daughter who left and didn't return must have fallen, and once fallen she was no longer mourned, just erased. The brothels were full of such ghosts. Young women who still carried fragments of lullabies, who still prayed in dialects they hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, but who no longer remembered the faces of their own mothers. One account, rescued from a dusty notebook tucked away in a provincial archive, tells of a girl who escaped her brothel and made it all the way back to her home village, only to be turned away by her own father. "You're not my daughter anymore," he told her. She wandered back toward the train station and was never seen again. And here's the twist. Not all the traffickers were men. Some were older women, former brothel workers, madams, or simply widows with nothing left to sell but promises. They'd return to villages pretending to be successful city folk, offering girls a better life. The girls trusted them. Why wouldn't they? They spoke the same language. They smiled like aunties. And then, when we were on the train, the smile disappeared. You keep walking heart heavy. In this world, the city is a machine, and the villages are just its feeder system. It consumes innocence and spits out silence. Every girl who steps off the train becomes someone else or disappears entirely, and no one stops it. Not the police, not the state, not the church. The machine just grinds forward. A gust of wind kicks up, swirling snow against your cheeks. You pass another window and catch sight of a young woman behind the glass, her face blank, her eyes fixed on nothing. Maybe she arrived last week, maybe last year. Either way, she's here now, caught in the city's grip, and she's not going home. You know that moment when everything is quiet but not peaceful? That thin, eerie kind of quiet where you can still feel the tension in the air, like a pulled wire stretched to its limit. That's the kind of silence you step into now. It's late, the streets are nearly empty, and the night's grown sharp, colder than it was an hour ago. You're near one of the poorer districts now, where the roofs sag under years of snow and smoke and every wall seems to lean just a little, like it's tired of standing. This is where desperation lives out loud, through windows that never fully shut and footsteps that never really rest. Here you start to understand the unholy triangle that shaped the daily life of sex workers in the Russian Empire. Virtue, vodka and violence. 3 forces pulling at each other constantly. 3 masks the empire insisted women wear, sometimes all at once. And for the women who worked the streets or brothels, trying to navigate that triangle was like trying to swim with stones in your coat pockets. Let's start with virtue, or the idea of it anyway. The empire was obsessed with purity, especially feminine purity. Not spiritual purity, not personal goodness, just the public-facing, socially useful kind. It didn't matter what your intentions were, or whether your choices came from survival. You were either clean or you weren't. A man could drink, gamble, visit brothels and still be called respectable. A woman could be seen once talking to the wrong person in public and find herself cast out from her family. And once you were out, that was it. The label never came off. Even for registered prostitutes, the moral expectations were impossibly twisted. You had to keep a clean room, dress decently when not working, and never be caught in public looking too glamorous, lest someone mistake you for a respectable woman and take offence. Women who worked were expected to remain visible and invisible all at once. The empire wanted them as a pressure valve for male desire, but they couldn't be too visible, couldn't suggest that sin was a lifestyle and not a shadow. Then there was vodka. Oh, vodka! It flowed through the veins of Imperial Russia like a second bloodstream. Cheap, accessible, and endlessly numbing. It was as common as bread, sometimes more common. For many sex workers, it started as a way to get through the night. Something to take the edge off before a client. A little fire in the throat to dull the rest. But over time, it became more than that. You drink because it helps you forget. Then you drink because forgetting is the only way to fall asleep. Then you drink because your hands won't stop shaking when you don't. Some brothel owners encouraged it. A drunk worker is easier to control, easier to coax into things she might say no to otherwise. And clients didn't mind, some even preferred it. There's something grotesque about that, isn't there? The way addiction wasn't just tolerated, but cultivated, encouraged. Because the more broken a woman became, the more compliant she often seemed. It's a brutal kind of efficiency. There's a case from 1904, buried in a tangle of municipal reports, about a woman named Elizaveta who was found in a brothel cellar, unconscious from alcohol poisoning. The madam told police she'd been sickly for weeks. Neighbours said they'd heard screams a few nights earlier. The file was closed within days. Cause of death. Complications from disease. But everyone knew what had really happened. She drank herself to death, likely encouraged, or at least permitted to do so, and no one stopped her. And that brings us to violence, the final point of the triangle and the sharpest. It was everywhere, behind closed doors. On snowy cobbled streets, in brothel stairwells, alleyways, even barred to medical clinics. And it didn't always come from the clients. Sometimes it came from the owners, sometimes from other women competing for survival in a space with no air, and sometimes from the people meant to protect them. The police, theoretically, were supposed to oversee registered brothels, enforce laws against unlicensed ones, and prevent abuse. In practice, many officers were clients, many more were bribed. Some ran their own backdoor networks of extortion. They'd threaten to arrest women for loitering, then offer to overlook the offence in exchange for money, or sex. It wasn't uncommon, it was routine, expected even. There's a particularly unsettling account from Reformer's Journal in 1898, detailing how officers in Moscow would routinely sweep the streets before a royal visit, arresting any woman suspected of prostitution, registered or not, and then, once the official business was over, release them in exchange for favours, no charges, no paperwork, just silence. And the worst part? There was no recourse, no hotline to call, no safe house to run to. If you were beaten by a client and you reported it, the first question would be, were you registered? The second would be, did you provoke him? The third, if it even came, would be, do you have witnesses? And you never did, because everyone else in that room was just trying to survive too, and silence had its own price. Still, these women found ways to fight back. Not always with fists, though that happened too. Sometimes with quiet resistance, refusing certain clients, hiding coins in floorboards, passing warnings to other women about dangerous men. There were whispered systems, shadow alliances, codes scratched into door frames or scrawled on the backs of matchbooks, little acts of rebellion in a world that had forgotten they existed. There's a strange, almost unbelievable story from a brothel near Kazan, where a group of women banded together and staged a fake disease outbreak to shut the place down. They soaked rags in vinegar, smeared themselves with powder to mimic lesions, and moaned loud enough to spook the clients. Within a week, the building was closed for sanitation. The women vanished into the city after that. No one ever caught them. It's unclear if the story is true, but people believed it, because hope clings to even the smallest victories. You stop at the edge of a bridge now, overlooking a frozen canal. The moonlight turns the ice silver. For a moment, the city looks peaceful, like something out of a painting. But you know better. You've seen what's behind the doors, what's under the snow, virtue, vodka, violence, 3 words that built invisible cages around tens of thousands of women. And yet in the cracks between them, life still stubbornly existed. Laughter, friendship, fury. A hand on a shoulder, a shared crust of bread. A whispered joke after a long, bruising night. Not hope exactly, but something close, and something just strong enough to keep going. You pull your coat tighter as you turn away from the canal. Somewhere behind you a dog barks once, then falls silent. Somewhere ahead footsteps echo on stone. The city keeps breathing, and so do you. You're back on the move, stepping across another icy intersection where the slush has frozen into uneven ridges. Your ankles ache from the constant tension of walking like a tightrope artist across cobblestones. But then again, balance is everything here. Balance between law and crime, between visibility and invisibility, and, in tonight's case, between wealth and degradation. Because now you're walking through the brothel districts by class, the Empire's own grim version of a menu. You didn't realise there was a hierarchy to this world until you stepped into it. But oh, there is. The Russian Empire didn't just tolerate prostitution, it categorised it, labelled it, and even colour-coded it. Not all brothels were equal, and not all women were treated, or priced, the same. There was an entire ladder here, and if you weren't born into the right place, you didn't even get to look at the top rung. The first-class brothels? Let's start there. These were the salons of vice, housed in mansions or upper-floor flats of gilded buildings in Saint Petersburg and Moscow's finer districts. The women here wore silk, they were fluent in French, some played piano, some read Pushkin aloud, they had calling cards. Calling cards, these weren't the girls pulled in from the provinces 2 days ago. No, these were trained courtesans, often educated women who had once belonged to the middle class but had fallen through debt, divorce or scandal. Clients here were nobles, foreign diplomats, well-connected officers. They came for more than sex, they came for theatre, for fantasy. For the illusion that they were visiting a cultured companion, not purchasing someone's body by the hour. The women in these brothels were expected to entertain, flatter, keep up in conversation. If you couldn't discuss opera, you didn't last. It was transactional intimacy wrapped in powdered wigs and chandeliers. And yet these women were still prisoners. Their wages might be higher, their rooms cleaner, but the same yellow tickets sat folded in their drawer, the same inspections. The same weekly trek to the clinic. Their clients might kiss their hands, but they still left money on the table when they left. You move a little deeper into the city's underbelly now, into the neighbourhoods of second and third class brothels. These were the mid-tier joints, rows of apartments marked by code numbers instead of names, a red curtain in the window, or a specific coloured lamp burning by the door. The rules here were looser, the spaces smaller, the women younger and more replaceable. You didn't need to speak French to work here, you just needed to survive the week. Inside one of these brothels you'd find shared beds, cheap wine, walls thin enough to hear every transaction in every room. The madam kept a tighter grip. There was less margin for error here, less tolerance for illness or refusal. Clients came in fast, left faster, and if a woman got sick, she didn't always go to a clinic. Sometimes she was just told to pack up and get out, which often meant straight to the street. These places smelled like boiled cabbage and wet wool. The women wore hand-me-down corsets, patch stockings, and smiles that cracked easily under pressure. There was laughter, yes, but the hollow kind, brittle and too loud. This was the level where most women landed if they didn't have connections or a gift for performance. Just a willingness to do what was asked and try not to think about it too hard. And then, farther down still, you reach the bottom tier. The Kalturas, the illegal dens, the slum brothels operating in condemned buildings and flooded basements. No velvet here, no candles, just a mattress on the floor, maybe a crate for a table, and a queue of drunk men who paid in rubles or bread or whatever they happened to have in their pocket. These places weren't listed in the registries. They didn't appear on any map, but they were everywhere. The women here didn't carry yellow tickets. Most of them didn't have papers at all. Some were runaways, some had escaped other brothels, some had been trafficked in and never registered. There were no inspections, no rules, only survival. The average life expectancy of a woman working in these brothels was pitiful, sometimes just a few months. Disease spread like fire. Violence went unpunished. And yet for the women who had nowhere else to go, this was still a form of shelter. Shelter with a cost. You pass by one of these buildings now. The shutters are broken. A pile of ashes smoulders in the street from a makeshift fire. A child runs by barefoot, chasing a tin can with a stick. Doesn't look like a place anyone would choose, but choice stopped being part of the conversation a long time ago. What's strange and morbidly fascinating is how even among the women, this hierarchy persisted. First-class girls wouldn't speak to the third-class ones, streetwalkers avoided the courtesans, everyone clung to whatever rung they could, even if it was crumbling beneath their feet, because here, status was all you had, and even the illusion of status could keep you sane for another week. There's a debate among historians about how rigid these class lines truly were. Some say women moved fluidly between levels, rising or falling depending on luck, youth or skill. Others argue the system was sticky. Once you were labelled a fouillador, it followed you. The brothels, after all, kept meticulous records, and a woman's past was never really past. It lived in ledgers, in whispers, in the eyes of every madam who looked you up and down before deciding what you were worth. There's one oddity that sticks out in the records, a brothel in Odessa that reportedly allowed women to graduate from one tier to another based on good behaviour and client satisfaction. Promotions, like a perverse version of corporate advancement. But even that was rare, and promotion just meant slightly fewer clients per day and a clean towel. You stop near a small cafe now, one that stays open late. Inside, two men in military coats sit with their backs to the window, laughing too loudly, steam rising from their teacups. You recognise the symbols on their collars. Officers. Mid-ranking. You wonder how many brothels they've visited this week. You wonder if they know the names of any of the women. Probably not. As the snow begins to fall again, soft and slow, you look back toward the darker parts of the street. Behind one of those shuttered doors, a woman is lighting a candle. Behind another, someone's counting coins, dividing them into piles, rent, food, bribe, vodka, and somewhere a girl is staring at herself in a broken mirror, trying to smooth her hair and forget what rung she's standing on. But the mirror always remembers. The bells ring out from the naval barracks just before dawn, sharp, metallic, and indifferent. You flinch slightly at the sound, not because it's loud, but because it marks the beginning of another day for a different kind of machine. One made not of gears and steam, but of men. Lots of them. Young, restless, poorly paid, often drunk, and utterly unprepared for what it means to be stationed in a city like Saint Petersburg or Vladivostok or Sevastopol. Soldiers and sailors, whole legions of them, had a quiet, unspoken arrangement with the brothels of the empire. And at the centre of it all sat a grim little trade-off. The state needed discipline in the barracks, and the brothels kept the men quiet. You pass a group of soldiers just off night patrol, their breath clouding the air as they joke with each other. Voices hoarse from shouting over the wind. Their boots are caked in half-melted snow, and you can smell the cheap vodka on them even from across the street. They're young, barely out of their teens, but already hardened by barrack life. A life that swung between boredom and violence like a metronome. For men like these, brothels weren't just temptation, they were routine. The military was one of the biggest drivers of prostitution in Imperial Russia, and not just through individual visits. There were whole systems in place to accommodate the needs of troops. Near every major garrison was a string of brothels, some sanctioned, some quietly tolerated. Many offered discounts for soldiers. Some even ran on fixed contracts with army officials. You think that's a joke? It wasn't. There are surviving reports of entire units being sent to the same brothel on rotation, like it was just another drill in the day's schedule. The logic behind it was predictably brutal. The military needed its men focused and not stirring up trouble in the streets. If they had somewhere to release tension, the theory went, they'd be less likely to brawl, desert, or harass the local populace. And so, prostitutes became unofficial instruments of discipline. They helped keep the barracks calm, the officers satisfied, and the illusion of order intact. The system didn't care about the women themselves, just that they were there, available, and quiet. But there was a cost, and that cost had a name: syphilis. By the 1890s, venereal disease had become a full-blown crisis within the military. Rates were staggering. Some regiments reported infection levels above 50%. In naval ports, the numbers were even worse. Syphilis, gonorrhea, chancroid. Words whispered in clinics and scrawled in ledgers with little understanding and even less empathy. Treatment was slow, inconsistent, and often just as damaging as the disease itself. Mercury rubs, sulfur fumes, internal doses of arsenic. You didn't get better, you just got different symptom. Naturally, the state blamed the prostitutes. Women were easier to control than soldiers, and easier to regulate than the conditions of barracks hygiene. So they enforced medical inspections, passed decrees, and expanded the reach of the sanitation offices. But the truth? Most of the disease spread from soldiers to prostitutes, not the other way around. Men refused to wear condoms, not that they were widely available, and carried infections from one woman to the next like a grim game of tag. And it wasn't just the soldiers. Sailors, especially those docked in imperial ports for weeks or months at a time, flocked to the brothel districts like flies to sugar. There are stories, borderline unbelievable, of ship crews lining up outside state-sanctioned brothels after weeks at sea, the line stretching around the block, with guards posted just to keep order. The women inside were expected to process as many as 20 men a night during these rushes. Some collapsed, some fled, others adjusted. You stop near a naval hospital now, its iron gates streaked with rust. Inside, men are coughing, shouting, some moaning in their sleep. One wing is reserved for syphilitic patients, segregated, forgotten. You hear rumours of experimental treatments, of patients shackled to beds to prevent escape. Medical journals of the time talk in cold clinical tones about insane effects of tertiary syphilis. They do not talk about the women these men infected. They do not list names. But there is one name, Anastasia, found in a letter smuggled out of a hospital ward in Kronstadt in 1906. She'd been a brothel worker assigned, unofficially, to a naval garrison. When an outbreak of venereal disease hit the base, she was blamed, along with 6 other women. All were detained, confined and subjected to what was called therapeutic discipline. Her letter, written in jagged script and hidden inside a hollowed-out bread crust, describes days of forced douching, injections that made her vomit blood, and nights she doesn't remember at all. Her final line, "I think they are testing things on us." Her letter ends there. No one knows what became of her. Particularly strange fact. The Russian Empire briefly flirted with the idea of creating soldier-only brothels staffed by the volunteers screened for health. It was, of course, a disaster. The women either became infected anyway or were so brutally treated by the soldiers that they abandoned the posts. The project was quietly scrapped, another chapter in the long book of ideas that prioritise military morale over human life. Some historians have tried to argue that sex work was, in its way, a kind of patriotism, that women who served soldiers were doing their duty, helping to maintain morale and national strength. You can't help but laugh bitterly at that mucker. What kind of patriotism is coerced? What kind of duty leaves you diseased, forgotten, and buried in an unmarked grave? The Empire never had an answer to that. It just kept marching forward, uniforms pressed and boots polished, dragging behind it a trail of used-up bodies like footprints in the snow. As you leave the hospital gate behind, the sun is just beginning to lift above the rooftops, casting pale orange onto the domes and smokestacks. You hear the drill whistles in the distance, harsh and shrill. The city is waking up, but somewhere behind closed doors, a woman is still trying to sleep off the night, hoping the next one doesn't come too soon. And it will. You've left the barracks behind now, trading military boots for marble staircases and long silences. This district of Saint Petersburg hums with a different energy, slower, more refined, almost dreamlike. The carriages here are quieter, the servants more polished, and the perfume in the air more expensive. You're in the part of the city where wealth folds over itself like layers of fur, where everything is elegant on the outside and completely frayed within. This is where the royals live, the elite, the women with French governesses, private ballet tutors, and husbands who attend state dinners twice a week. And yet, even here, behind lace curtains and crystal chandeliers, the sex trade casts its shadow. It's just softer, hidden behind philanthropy and pious tears. Tonight, you're peeking through the keyhole of the Empire's own hypocrisy into the delicate, complicated role of the royal women and the strange guilt that clung to their skirts like static. The Tsarina, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, was not the kind of ruler who ignored suffering entirely, at least not publicly. During her reign, especially in the early 1900s, she funded orphanages, visited clinics, and hosted tea fundraisers for women's charities. There were reports, often heavily romanticised, of her personally visiting hospitals for fallen women, praying with them, even washing their feet. It made for lovely column inches. It made the Empress seem like a mother to the nation, radiant with compassion. But you scratch the surface and it all starts to wobble. Because while Alexandra and her inner circle of aristocratic ladies busied themselves with charitable visits and lace-trimmed lectures on virtue, the policies of the Empire, the very system they presided over, remained completely unchanged. Prostitution continued to be licensed, inspected and punished. The same yellow tickets were issued. The same clinics operated under the same assumptions, that women who sold sex were broken, dangerous and expendable. So what was this really then? Philanthropy or guilt management? You step into the memory of a grand reception hall. Gleaming parquet floors, gilded columns, a chandelier the size of a stagecoach dripping with crystal. Somewhere in this very room, there had once been a charity ball to raise money for fallen women. Guests arrived in pearls and tailored uniforms. A string quartet played Tchaikovsky. The pastries were shaped like tiny roses. And the topic of the evening? A campaign to fund new reformatories, where former prostitutes could be retrained for service roles. Maids mostly, or seamstresses. It all sounds noble until you realise what those institutions were actually like. No windows, no contact with the outside world. Forced prayer schedules, solitary confinement for rule breakers. Women were not treated as survivors of abuse or poverty. They were treated as moral defects in need of cleansing. And if they failed to meet expectations, they were quietly handed over to police custody and sent to workhouses or worse. But the upper-class women who visited these places didn't see that part. They saw the drawing rooms, the docile inmates, the carefully rehearsed greetings. It was a kind of theatre. One where rich women got to feel useful, and poor women were expected to play along in exchange for a few pieces of bread and the faint hope of employment. There's an especially bizarre fringe tale about the Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, who supposedly tried to open a school for reformed courtesans that included lessons in etiquette, piano and French grammar. Yes, really. The idea was that these women could become proper ladies again through exposure to culture. The project lasted less than 6 months, not because the women weren't capable, but because no one would hire them afterward. Once you had a yellow ticket, or worse, once someone whispered that you'd once had one, you were marked for life. No education could scrub it away. Still, this story gets told with admiration in some corners, as if Maria Pavlovna was ahead of her time. Maybe she was, or maybe she was just playing at redemption with no understanding of the game. Her efforts were like trying to rebuild a house by painting the broken windows. You pass the Church of the Saviour on spilled blood, now, its domes glowing faintly in the dawn light. Alexandra used to visit this place to pray for her son, the haemophiliac heir who had come to symbolise the empire's fragility. In her journals, she sometimes wrote about Russia's moral decay, the sin in the streets, the unmentionable women corrupting the city. But she never connected those women to her court's politics, never saw how their suffering was, in part, manufactured by the very system her husband ruled. It's strange to think about now, how the empire's most powerful women could weep for the souls of strangers, but never question the structures that crushed those souls to begin with. Their compassion was personal, emotional, and completely detached from policy. They saw the women as damaged dolls, not as human beings trying to survive in a system that offered them 2 choices, compliance or disappearance. There's a letter preserved in an old aristocratic archive, a note from a brothel worker named Zoya, written to the Empress herself. It's brief, polite, desperate. She thanks Alexandra for visiting her clinic, says she looked like a saint, and then asks, with carefully measured words, if she might intercede so Zoya can leave the brothel and return to her village without arrest. There's no record of a reply. The letter was found folded into the pages of a prayer book, never opened. Scholars still argue over how much power these royal women actually had. Some claim Alexandra was trapped, manipulated by ministers and Rasputin alike. Others say she could have done more, used her influence to dismantle the reglementation system, or at least push for reforms. But the debate itself feels tired, doesn't it? At some point, power unused is just permission for cruelty to continue. You turn a corner and the air smells sweeter here. Bakery bread, candle wax, maybe a trace of lavender. This part of the city pretends the rest of it doesn't exist. No yellow tickets here, just embroidered gloves and laced parasols and stories about charity that stop short of truth. Behind one of these shutters, a noblewoman stirs in her bed, unaware, or maybe just unwilling to remember, that 10 blocks from here, another woman is trying to wash blood from a sheet before the next client knocks. You're back beneath the winter sky now, moving toward a towering silhouette carved out in quiet stone, the unmistakable outline of a Russian Orthodox cathedral. Its domes rise like frozen fire against the pale blue light, onion-shaped and gilded, shimmering faintly even in the cold dawn. You step lightly now, cautious, because what you're about to walk into is not just a place of worship. It's a contradiction wrapped in incense and hymn, The Russian Orthodox Church, with all its pageantry of candles and gold leaf icons, cast a long shadow over the empire's moral code. It was the spiritual spine of Tsarist authority, the ever-watchful eye presiding over family, tradition, and the idea of what made a woman pure. But when it came to the thousands, tens of thousands of sex workers living within the empire's borders, the church's gaze got a little blurry, or maybe just conveniently averted. You push open the heavy wooden doors of a parish chapel. The scent of myrrh hits you instantly, mingled with melted wax and centuries of dust. It's beautiful in here, quiet, solemn, a sacred hush hanging between the flicker of votive candles and the low echo of footsteps on flagstone. An old woman kneels before the iconostasis, whispering a prayer. A priest stands near the front, his cassock flowing around him like shadow. And if you didn't know better, you might believe this was a sanctuary for all souls. But that's the thing, it wasn't. Prostitutes were rarely seen inside churches, and if they were, they stayed in the back, head down, eyes lowered, avoiding attention like a mouse scuttling across a cathedral floor. Officially, the church labelled them as sinners, fallen women who had strayed too far to be embraced by the flock, unclean, spiritually infected. Many priests refused to administer sacraments to women with yellow tickets. Confession was sometimes denied. Communion, not a chance, and yet the same church turned a blind eye to the brothels operating down the street. The hypocrisy wasn't even subtle. Some of the clergy were clients themselves. That's not rumour, that's buried in records, whispered in memoirs, even hinted at in satirical newspapers of the time. There are stories of priests delivering sermons about sin on Sunday mornings, then visiting third-tier brothels on Sunday nights. The robes came off. The sins stayed on. This duality, the sacred and the shameful, was everywhere. The church taught that a woman's worth was bound to her modesty, her obedience, her virginity until marriage. Once lost, so was her place in the community, no matter the reason. It didn't matter if she had been tricked, sold, abandoned, or born into poverty with no other options. Once a woman stepped into that world, she was stained. And the church, for all its incense and ritual, rarely offered absolution. There's a scholarly debate still raging in some circles over whether the church could have done more. Some historians argue that the institution had little power to affect state regulation of prostitution, that it was bound by bureaucracy and imperial law. Others, more critically, say the church chose comfort over confrontation, that it preferred the illusion of piety to the messy work of compassion. And honestly, the silence says a lot, but it wasn't complete silence. There were exceptions, rogue priests, radical monks, tiny outposts of compassion flickering in the cold. You read once about a priest in a remote village outside Smolensk who refused to turn away women with yellow tickets. He heard their confessions, gave them communion, even blessed the stillborn children of prostitutes when no one else would. He was reprimanded by his diocese, threatened with removal, but he kept doing it until he died of pneumonia in a shack with no roof. The local women pooled what they had to bury him. No church officials attended the funeral, another fringe detail. Some reform-minded theologians tried to reframe the conversation entirely. They argued that prostitution was not a spiritual failing, but a social sin, a result of imperial inequality, not personal depravity. One even published a series of anonymous essays in a Moscow journal under the name Father Lazarus, calling for brothel abolition and state-funded housing for vulnerable women. The essays were quickly banned. He was never identified. Or maybe he was. Maybe they just made him disappear. You move toward the front of the chapel now, where the icons shimmer behind golden doors. Saints look down at you with carved serenity, their eyes frozen in time. There's one, Saint Mary of Egypt, who was once a prostitute herself, according to the church's own law. She repented, fled into the desert, and lived 40 years in solitude, surviving on roots and prayer. The church holds her up as a model of redemption, but only because she erased herself entirely. That's the standard: disappear, suffer, and maybe then, maybe, you'll be forgiven. It's hard not to notice the contradiction. The empire legalized prostitution, the police managed it, the military fueled it, and the church pretended it wasn't happening, or blamed the women who survived it. Like moral math, the entire system didn't add up, but nobody questioned the equation. Outside the chapel, you hear the clang of a trolley bell. The city is stirring now. You walk out under a pale pink sky, watching your breath fog up in front of you. A few blocks away, a girl with tired eyes wraps a scarf around her face and disappears into a side street. You wonder if she tried to go to church once, if she stood in the back too afraid to light a candle, if someone told her she didn't belong, or if she just told herself. What the church offered wasn't salvation, it was a mirror. One that showed women what they had lost but not how to reclaim it, not unless they were willing to suffer beautifully, quietly, alone. And so the brothels kept buzzing, the clinics kept filling, and the prayers, well, those kept rising too. Just not always for the people who needed them most. You're in an alley now, narrow, crooked, barely wide enough for two people to pass without brushing shoulders. The stones are slick with frost and old ash, and if you didn't know better, you'd think this was just a forgotten passageway, tucked behind a butcher's shop or a seamstress's quarters, but it's not. This is a shortcut, a well-worn artery in the body of the empire's bureaucracy, because right here, behind a door that looks like it hasn't been opened in years, is a room filled with the quiet hum of something truly dangerous. Paperwork. You step inside and are met with the smell of dust, ink, and tobacco, bureaucracy's holy trinity. The light is dim, filtered through grime-coated windows and half-closed blinds. In the corner, a clerk with a cigarette dangling from his lips scribbles into a ledger without looking up. Piles of folders are stacked on every available surface, each tied in faded ribbon, each stamped with a wax seal like it holds some sacred truth. And in a way they do. These are the records of prostitution in the Russian Empire, not the morality plays you hear in church, not the whispered stories of brothels and courtesans, but the cold bureaucratic truth every woman registered, every address, every inspection date, every violation. The state, in its infinite obsession with order, documented everything, and in doing so it turned human tragedy into data. There's a strange chill to it all. You look through one folder and find a list of names, each followed by a brief note. Non-compliant with medical examination, moved without permission, suspected illness, no backstory, no context, just ink on a page. The clerks who wrote these didn't see women. They saw columns, and the system didn't need to understand suffering, it just needed it recorded. That's how trafficking survived so easily within this system. It was buried under paperwork. Girls arrived from the countryside, often underage, often unnamed, and once they were processed, they disappeared into the machinery. A registration here, a housing record there, no red flags, no raised voices. If someone paid a bribe or filed a forged document, the ink made it all real. A signature could legalize a kidnapping, a stamp could silence a scream, and bribery, well, it was practically a language in itself. Police officers, clinic doctors, brothel owners, inspectors, all fluent in the same quiet nods and exchanged rubles. Want to skip a medical exam this week? That's 10 kopecks. Want to open a brothel near the docks without going through zoning? 25. Wants to keep a girl on the books even though she ran away 6 months ago. Depends who you ask. In Saint Petersburg alone, entire sectors of the police force were assigned to moral oversight, a title that sounded noble but really meant maintaining the illusion of order. They visited brothels, filled out forms, made notes, and collected envelopes. One officer boasted in a private letter, found years later in a trunk in his granddaughter's attic, that he could recite the price of sonnets on every street from the Admiralty to the Neva. He even listed them. Like a travel guide, clean silence, 20 kopecks, loud silence, 50, permanent silence, negotiable. Sometimes the system made mistakes. A woman might be double registered, her name appearing in 2 different brothels, or worse, 2 different cities. And instead of raising alarm, this was often treated like a clerical error. A crossed out line, a shrug. One particularly bizarre case from Odessa involved a woman who had been declared deceased in an official report, only to be re-registered 6 months later under a new name. Same birth date, same photo, same handwriting. No one blinked. Bureaucracy, after all, doesn't do ghosts. It just makes new folders. There was a fringe belief among some civil servants that the paperwork itself was a form of justice. That by recording everything, every inspection, every brothel license, every disease diagnosis, they were somehow civilizing the process, keeping it clean. But what they were really doing was codifying a system that never cared about the women inside it. The data existed to protect the state, not the people. You find a stack of handwritten notes tucked into one corner, unsigned, unsealed, and clearly not meant for official records. There are complaints, petitions, requests for transfer, a few are pleas for mercy. One reads, in trembling script, "I have followed all orders, I have submitted to every doctor, I am not sick, but the madam says I am worthless now, please let me go home." It is not dated. There is no reply, and then there's the strangest piece in the entire room, a hand-drawn map, carefully inked, with precise lettering and delicate hatching to show elevation. It outlines the location of brothels across a city district, not just the legal ones, but the unofficial dens as well. It's been annotated by hand in red pencil. Too many girls here. Doctor not reliable. Police overcharging this house. It looks less like a planning document and more like battlefield intelligence. You wonder who drew it. A reformer? A cop? A brothel owner keeping tabs on the competition? Whoever it was, they knew the system too well, and they knew that everything came down to paper. If you could manipulate the forms, you could control the whole network. Historians still disagree on how far this corruption went. Some believe it was local, just a few crooked officials here and there. Others argue it was systemic, woven into the empire's fabric like mould between bricks. The truth is probably both. A system doesn't rot all at once. It decays in pieces, silently, until no one remembers what clean wood even looked like. As you step back into the alley, the sun finally begins to break through the clouds above. A shaft of pale gold slants across the rooftops. Catching on a line of laundry strung between two buildings, the city looks peaceful for a moment, harmless, but you've seen what lies beneath: the ledgers, the stamps, the signatures that turn suffering into formality. And somewhere, in a basement brothel or a narrow tenement room, another woman is being told to line up for inspection. Her name is written down, her temperature is recorded, and in a dusty office 3 streets over, a man in a grey coat stamps her folder without ever seeing her face. There's a sound that doesn't belong here. A skipping rhythm, a thump-thump click of small feet on wet stones. You turn toward it and see her, barely 10, maybe younger, darting between barrels in a side alley, clutching something in her fist. A bread crust, maybe. Her coat's too big, sleeves dragging past her fingers, and her boots don't match. She sees you watching and freezes for a second, then vanishes behind a boarded-up shop with the speed of a rabbit. Gone. Just like that. And now you know where we are. This part of the city, this particular district, has its own rules, its own secrets, and the worst of them wear small shoes. Because in the shadow of the Russian Empire's massive machine of prostitution, beneath the ledgers and brothels and clinics, there was another layer, a quieter one, smaller, sometimes too small to even reach the door handle. We're talking now about the children, the girls who were swept into the system before they'd even finished growing. You want to believe it didn't happen, that it couldn't, that even the most hardened madames and corrupt police officers drew a line somewhere, but they didn't, not always, and the state drew that line in pencil. Officially, prostitution was restricted to women over 16. That was the age for legal registration. But just like any law in the Russian Empire, enforcement depended entirely on who was watching and who was being paid to look away. And out here, in the alleyways and unregulated dens, the law wasn't just ignored, it was erased. You pass a narrow door set into the side of a crumbling tenement. There's no sign, no curtain, nothing to mark it as a brothel. But the way the windows are blacked out, the quiet rustle inside, the man leaning against the wall, pretending not to guard the entrance. You know what this is. And if you know, so do the authorities. They just don't care. Or worse, they already took their cut. In places like this, girls were brought in under the radar. Some were runaways, others sold outright by their families. Just until the debt is paid, the parents might say, or she'll have a roof at least. But the debt never got smaller, and the roof often came with fists. Some girls were never even registered. They were called bezbilietne hershom, without tickets. Not in the system. No rights, no protections. And in a dark twist, that made them more valuable. Certain clients preferred it that way. They paid more for younger girls, more for fresh faces, more for the assurance that no doctor had ever seen them. It was the ugliest kind of premium. Innocence as a commodity. Pain as a delicacy. There's a record hidden in an internal police memo from 1895 of a raid on an unlicensed brothel in Kiev. 8 girls found. Only 2 were over the age of 16. 1 was just 11. They were all employed, according to the madam, who claimed that they were servants and companions, not the sex workers. The inspector wrote one sentence at the end of his report. No further action taken. He even complimented the cleanliness of the establishment. Clean floors, dirty soles, and it wasn't just about the brothels. These girls were everywhere, on the streets, in bathhouses, in railway stations, offering company to passing travellers. Some worked alone, Others were managed by pimps who kept them fed just enough to move, dressed just enough to pass. If you asked them how old they were, they'd lie. They had to, because the minute someone said too young, the whole transaction became a crime. And no one wanted a crime. Not the client, not the madam, certainly not the police. You hear a story sometimes, whispered, like a ghost tale about a girl named Raisa. She was found wandering in a Saint Petersburg market square with no shoes and blood on her hem. A grocer took pity on her, gave her a roll and asked her name. She couldn't remember. She'd been sold too many times, passed from brothel to brothel, city to city. She was maybe 12. Her body was wrecked. She couldn't stop shaking. The grocer reported her to the police. The police returned her to her previous guardian, who had already filed a missing child report. Case closed. File stamped. Raisa disappeared again within a week. And the most awful part, these weren't rare cases. They were everywhere, just kept quiet. Forgotten as easily as they were used. In some cities, underground orphanages doubled as recruitment centres for brothels. Charitable institutions, they were called. But many had deals with local pimps or corrupt officials. A hungry girl could be placed in a work situation by a sponsor. That sponsor was usually a madam. And once the door closed behind her, no one came to check on her again. There are arguments even now among scholars about just how widespread this was. Some say the empire tried to crack down on child prostitution in the early 20th century. That there were efforts, half-hearted, uneven, to raise the registration age, to increase inspections. And maybe that's true. Maybe somewhere someone passed a law with good intentions, but laws on paper mean nothing in a city where everything else runs on silence and rubles. The children didn't vanish because policy changed. They vanished because no one wanted to see them. You pause beside a crumbling wall covered in chalk drawings. Simple things, a sun, a house, a stick figure girl holding hands with someone bigger. Innocent, maybe. Or maybe just heartbreaking. You look down and there's the sound again, that thump-thump click of mismatched boots. She's watching you from around the corner, face blank, eyes too old for her size. You nod gently. She doesn't move. Doesn't smile, just disappears again, quick and quiet. And what are you supposed to do? Report it? To who? The ones who sold her, the ones who inspect her, the ones who pretend she's not real. You realise in this moment that there are thousands like her, some with names, some without, some who still believe they'll grow up, some who already know they won't. This city eats children, dresses them up and calls it work, and when it's done, it forgets their faces before the sheets are even cold. It's just after midnight now, and the city has settled into that eerie quiet where the snow absorbs even the sounds of footsteps. You walk past windows that flicker with oil lamps, little pockets of warmth behind frosted glass. And you imagine what might be happening just beyond the curtains. Somewhere, a client is dressing again, buckling his belt with the dull routine of someone who's done this too many times. Somewhere else, a woman lies back on a creaking bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for the next knock. And above it all, somewhere in a locked drawer or a police archive or a dusty stack of forgotten papers, their stories are being stored or buried. But tonight you're going to listen, not to the ledgers, not to the registries, but to the voices behind the doors. The women whose stories were never meant to be remembered, but who left behind traces anyway. Letters, diaries, scrawled confessions tucked beneath floorboards, ghost voices from the rooms upstairs. You find your way into an old building now, one that's been repurposed for decades. By day it's a bakery, by night it's just another part of the silence. But if you go up the narrow staircase past the apartments, past the rooms that haven't been touched in years, you'll find a small attic room. Bare floorboards, walls faded with damp, and a trunk in the corner. It takes effort, but the lid creaks open and inside you find what you weren't supposed to. A bundle of papers tied with red string, stained at the corners with wax and time. The first page is a diary, dated 1893, written in flowing script, careful, deliberate, with the kind of precision that suggests schooling, at least for a few years. The author signs only with a first name, Lisa. She writes about the weather, her roommate usually makes the food, but then it shifts. She writes about a man who visits every Thursday. Always the same perfume, always the same request. She writes, "He does not hurt me, but it feels like I leave my body while he's here. I stare at the window and pretend it is raining." It's the next entry that hits harder. She talks about her friend Dunya who tried to run. She said she was going to the country to find her brother, but I found her the next day in the hallway. She hadn't gotten far. The madam smiled too much that day. We did not ask questions. You turn the pages slowly, your breath catching in your throat more than once. Lisa writes about her hopes, which grow smaller with each week. At first, she writes of leaving, then of saving money, then just of surviving the winter. The last entry is dated April. He didn't come this week. I don't know if I feel relief or fear. I had a dream that I lived above a library, and no one knew what I did at night. They only asked what I liked to read. There's no further entry, no date of death, just silence. You sift through this bundle and find another letter. This one much rougher, scribbled in pencil on scrap paper, filled with spelling errors and crossed out lines. It's unsigned, clearly never sent, probably never intended to be. It's addressed to the one I left behind. The writer talks about a small village, a mother who cried too much, and a boy named Pavel. You said you would wait. I know you did not. I would not either. Then later, I work in a house with red curtains. I do not speak of it, even to myself, but I'm still alive. That has to mean something. Even in these fragments, you hear the shape of a person, a full real person, reduced by the world around her into a function, a record, a cost. But not here. In these pages, they reappear. Girls who loved, girls who wept, girls who laughed even. One margin is filled with doodles of flowers and a note that reads, Anya tried to sing like the lady at the theatre today. She sounded like a dying goose. We all nearly choked from laughing. That one catches you off guard. You think of all the rooms like this one, scattered across the empire, attics, closets, drawers, holding the ghosts of women who were never allowed to keep their own stories. Most didn't leave anything behind. The empire didn't encourage reflection. It certainly didn't encourage memory. But a few did, and that's what you have here. A few scraps of soul surviving the grindstone of history. There's a fringe theory whispered among archivists that a brothel in Moscow secretly ran a literacy group. Not formal schooling, just women teaching each other how to write their names, how to read the newspaper, how to scribble a diary. Some say it was started by a girl who'd been a governess before she fell into debt. Others say it was an older madam who had a soft spot for the girls who arrived mute with shame. It may have only lasted a few months, but the idea that women stripped of power, of name, of voice, used scraps of paper to reclaim something, that sticks with you. And even now, there's debate among scholars about how many of these writings were real. Some will argue they're forgeries, fiction passed off as fact by reformers who wanted to provoke sympathy. Others say the emotional tone is too raw, too specific to be anything but real. But honestly, does it matter? The truth of them is in the feeling, in the bone-deep weariness between lines, in the hope that somehow someone would read their words one day and remember that they lived. You walk out of the attic slowly, the bundle still in your hands, heart heavy with the weight of so many names no one cared to keep. Back in the cold, the sky has gone ink black, and the stars are faint behind clouds that never quite leave. You stand there, pages pressed to your chest, and wonder, how many women left behind letters like these? How many stories are still buried under floorboards and forgotten closets, waiting to be found? You don't know, but you do know this. The rooms upstairs were not silent. Not really. They whispered, they wept, and sometimes when no one was listening they wrote. The snow has turned to rain now, soft, reluctant drops that tap against windows and run like peace tears down the stone faces of the buildings around you. The streets glisten, reflecting gaslight and carriage wheels like puddles of old gold. The city looks tired. You can almost feel it sigh. And here, in this part of town, something feels different. The brothels are still here, yes, but they're quieter, cleaner. The girls wear gloves, speak more softly. And if you didn't know better, you might mistake this for some bohemian boarding house, not another, spoke in the empire's wheel of shame. Because tonight, you're not in the slums or in the dark basements of desperation. You're in the drawing rooms of the middle-class prostitutes, women who were educated, fluent in multiple languages, sometimes even daughters of minor nobles. Women who at some point made a conscious, rational decision to enter the sex trade, not because they were trafficked or starving, but because the other options were worse. It's hard to swallow, isn't it, that someone could choose this, that an educated woman, trained to read Tolstoy and play the piano, might prefer the brothel to the factory or the kitchen. But that's exactly what happened for many. And when you hear their stories, it stops sounding like a fall from grace and starts sounding like a calculated trade. You step into one of these respectable brothels, quiet, candle-lit, with wallpaper that doesn't peel and chairs that match. The madam here doesn't wear a shawl or bark orders. She glides like a hostess at a salon, offering tea and soft looks and the illusion of dignity. And her girls, they speak well. They know how to keep a conversation alive. They can flirt in 3 languages and recite poems about spring. They're not wearing corsets pulled tight with rope. They're wearing perfume from Paris and dresses tailored to flatter, not restrain. You meet one of them in a side room sitting at a writing desk, pen in hand. Her name is Natalia, 28. She used to teach French to the daughters of a merchant family in Kazan. Then the merchant died. The family cut staff. She was left with no home, no money, and no references, because teachers, even good ones, are disposable when the man of the house dies. So she came to St. Petersburg, found a room, and realised the only job that paid enough to cover rent and food was the one she never expected to take. Natalia doesn't look ashamed. Tired, yes. A little guarded, but not broken. She tells you she works 3 nights a week. Her clients are mostly civil servants, lawyers, once even a professor. She screens them herself. She reads a great deal, writes poetry when she can, and yes, she's registered, carries the yellow ticket, folds it into her coat like a scar that's healed but never fully fades. But she insists this life, as strange and cruel as it is, gave her more control than she ever had as a governess. It's hard to argue with her. You think about the lives of women like her outside the brothel, factory jobs that paid pennies, sweatshops filled with dust and steam, domestic service where you cooked for 12 hours and were still scolded for breathing too loudly. And always, the risk of being fired without reason, of being groped by an employer, of being blamed if someone's son couldn't keep his hands to himself. In the brothel, Natalia earns enough to send money to her younger brother, to eat well, to live alone if she wants. That doesn't mean it's glamorous. She hates some clients, feels disgusted by others, but she decides who she sees, how often, what she'll tolerate. It's still a cage, but at least here she picked the wallpaper. There's a strange fact buried in the imperial police reports. In the late 1800s, a significant number of registered prostitutes listed their previous profession as teacher or governess. Another large portion came from clerical roles, typists, office assistants, shop girls, all literate, all trained for respectable work. But respectability didn't pay when the economy dipped or a man decided your handwriting wasn't graceful enough. Some scholars today insist this was a form of agency, that these women, especially the educated ones, weren't victims, they were pragmatists. They looked at their options and chose the one with the most autonomy, even if it came with stigma. Others argue it was still coercion by circumstance. That survival is not true choice, even if it feels like one. The truth, of course, is tangled. Always is. You look around Natalia's room and notice the little things, the bookshelf stacked with French novels, the pressed flowers between panes of glass, a drawing of a bridge, maybe one she passed on her way here before the snow started falling. It's not luxury, but it's lived in. Intentional. There's power in that. But still, that yellow ticket waits in the top drawer. Natalia shows you the rest of the house. You pass another woman reading quietly, another scribbling numbers into a ledger. Some of them save, some dream of opening a shop, some say nothing at all. You sense that not all the stories here are so composed. Not all the choices were as conscious. One girl, no older than 19, avoids your eyes entirely. You don't ask. There's a letter pinned to the wall in the common room, part poem, part diary entry, unsigned. It reads, "I am not fallen, only rearranged. My shape changed to fit the room I was given. I sleep beneath velvet, but I still dream in dirt." You step back outside and the rain has stopped. The sky has that strange deep blue hue that only appears between storms, like the world is catching its breath. You think about the myth of the respectable prostitute, how people love to hold her up as proof that the system had nuance. That some women chose it, lived well, maybe even flourished. But it's just that, a myth. Because every woman you met tonight still bore the same brand. No matter how literate, no matter how graceful, she was still reduced to the same label, bound by the same rules, watched by the same doctors. The house just smelled better. The uniform catches your eye first. Black wool, polished brass buttons, a belt pulled tight like it's holding the man together. You've seen dozens of them tonight, scattered like chess pieces across St. Petersburg, but this one's different. He's leaning against a lamppost with a kind of practiced boredom that only comes from years on the job. His cap sits low over his brow, shadowing eyes that scan the street with all the indifference of someone reading a newspaper article they've already seen twice. This is a city policeman, a man tasked with maintaining order, keeping the peace, or upholding the laws of the Russian Empire. But you already know better than to believe the uniform, because behind the ironed coat and brass badge is another face, one that looks shockingly similar to the clients you've been watching shuffle in and out of brothels all night. The Russian police weren't just bystanders to the sex trade, they were built into it, woven into the very fabric of how prostitution operated in the empire. They regulated it, profited from it, even at times protected it, though not in the way that word should mean. You follow the officer with your eyes as he lights a cigarette, exhales slowly, then turns his back to the brothel entrance behind him. That brothel, by the way, pays him. Maybe not officially, but regularly. A few rubles each week to ensure inspections happen at the right time, that reports stay favourable, that complaints from neighbours somehow never reach the higher-ups. It's not subtle, it's just understood. There are whole networks of this. At the district level, police chiefs maintained lists, not just of registered prostitutes, but of troublemakers, flight risks, and valuable assets. Valuable, of course, meaning profitable. Some officers operated their own brothels on the side. Others leased protection to madams, promising to overlook unregistered girls or help retrieve runaways, so long as the money kept flowing. And if a girl tried to leave the system, to go clean, move cities, find honest work, that same officer might suddenly show up with threats, or worse, remind her of an old violation that mysteriously reappeared in her file. There's one documented case, half buried in the archives, of a young woman named Masha who attempted to leave a registered brothel after saving enough to open a small laundry. Days after her first advertisement ran in a local paper, the police raided her shop citing zoning violations. No such violations were ever recorded. 2 days later, she was back in the brothel. The officer assigned to her district made a note in her file, reinstated. Some police played more violent roles. Whispers tell of night patrols where officers would arrest streetwalkers and offer a choice, a fine she couldn't afford or a favour behind the station house. Some girls chose the fine anyway, some didn't. Either way, the system made it clear. Power wears a uniform, and if you disobey it, the city has more than enough basements and silence to deal with you. And yet strangely, there were occasional officers who actually tried to help. You read about one in the files from Kazan, a man who reportedly turned in his own precinct commander for extorting underage girls. He was demoted within a week, reassigned to a rural post where he quietly retired after 1 year. His name appears only once after that, in the footnotes of an internal memo, labelled "not a good fit." Still, most played the game, and well, some became so entangled with the brothels they acted more like managers than enforcers. They monitored quotas, arranged protection from rowdy clients, even advised on pricing strategies. There's a letter, scribbled in shorthand, between two police captains discussing whether a specific brothel near the railway should be allowed to raise rates during a visiting naval tour. Not whether it was legal, just whether it was appropriate for morale. And here's a quirk for you. The Imperial Police maintained a euphemistic internal term for their role in the sex trade. They called it Blagoslovennoye Prisutstvie, the blessed presence, as if their oversight somehow sanctified the entire arrangement, that by showing up in uniform, they were bringing order, legitimacy, grace. The language was absurd and cruel, because what they were really doing was ensuring the machine kept turning uninterrupted. You pass another officer now, this one younger, his coat too big, his expression nervous. He's probably new. Still learning how to balance the orders from above with the realities below. He glances toward you, then away, clearly uneasy. You wonder if he'll end up like the others, jaded, detached, just another functionary in a system that runs on silence and coin, or if he'll quit before he ever starts believing this is normal. There's a debate among historians about just how organised all this corruption really was. Some argue it was a loose network of bad actors, uncoordinated but widespread. Others say there was a system behind it, handbooks, directives, tacit approvals from the top. The truth likely lies in that grey middle ground where unofficial policies become de facto law. What's clear is this: the police were not just enforcers of the prostitution system, they were participants, gatekeepers, clients, brokers. They wore their authority like armour, and used it not to protect women but to manage them, to keep them in line, to remind them that even within a legal system, they were never safe. You stop at a corner where two officers are talking quietly, passing a flask between them. Just behind them, a woman exits a brothel and lights a cigarette with a hand that trembles ever so slightly. She walks fast, coat pulled tight, face unreadable. The officers glance at her. One of them nods. She doesn't look back. The streetlight above you flickers, casting everything in gold for a moment, then letting it fade into shadow. You realise something then, that in this world, even justice has a price. Even the law has fingerprints it refuses to clean. And when power wears a uniform, the question isn't whether it's watching you. The question is what it wants in return. There's a war on. Not here, not on the quiet street where the snow falls like a whispered prayer and the storefronts have closed for the night, but far away, on some distant front where the cold bites harder and men shout in languages that echo like death. You feel it though. It creeps in like smoke under the door. The empire is shifting, groaning under the weight of conscripts and casualties and bureaucrats who wear fur while their soldiers freeze. And as always, when the great machine turns toward war, the smallest gears, the most disposable, begin to spin faster. Tonight, you're walking through a district that's busier than usual. Not because business is booming exactly, but because war feeds appetite. It amplifies desire and desperation in equal measure. And nowhere is that more visible than in the brothels where, in one of the empire's darkest moral contortions, sex work was quietly reframed as patriotism. Yes, you heard that right. During times of war, especially the Russo-Turkish War and later the Russo-Japanese conflict, the Russian government not only tolerated prostitution, but began to lean into it. Soldiers needed relief, the thinking went. Morale needed to be kept high, and the brothel became part of that calculation. A functional necessity, another cog in the military apparatus, like field kitchens and gunpowder. Behind every clean-shaven officer was a woman with a yellow ticket and a worn mattress. You pass a large building near the barracks. It's cleaner than most, with a small lantern burning steadily over the door. No signage, of course, but you know, everyone knows, this is one of the unofficial military houses, where registered prostitutes serve military clients at regulated rates. Regulated by who? The local police, mostly, or sometimes the military doctors, who make weekly rounds like they're checking livestock. The women here are inspected more often than usual, not for their protection, mind you, but for the soldiers. There's a file buried in the archives from 1905 listing the inspection schedule for a brothel that serviced an entire regiment. The women were examined every 48 hours, scrubbed, measured, questioned, if anything looked unusual. They were pulled from rotation, temporarily, until they were either cleared or discarded. The language in the file? Unfit for duty. As if they were boots or rifles. And here's the worst part. Some of these women were recruited specifically for this work, not through open contracts or advertisements, but through veiled state-backed programs that offered incentives. Serve your country, the leaflet said, support the troops. In some cities, women were offered higher rations, housing vouchers, or protection in exchange for working with the military. For women with nothing, no job, no home, maybe children to feed, those promises sounded like salvation. What they got instead was routine dehumanization, often for less money than they'd have earned in a street-level brothel. One particularly chilling account comes from a small village near the front lines of the Russo-Japanese War, where a group of 15 women were relocated by military command to set up a mobile brothel. These weren't volunteers, they were picked up by officers from surrounding towns, given a medical check, and placed on a train. Their destination was a makeshift camp, just miles from the battlefield. Their job? To keep morale stable. What happened to them after the war ended? No record. Not even names. There's a fringe anecdote about a madam who tried to organise a formal protest, yes, a protest, on behalf of her girls during the war. She wrote to a regional governor, arguing that her workers were fulfilling a vital patriotic function and therefore deserved increased pay, better housing and medical protection. Her letter astonishingly survived. It ends with this line: "If our bodies are to serve the empire should at least keep the roof from leaking." There is no record of a response, but this wasn't just a military issue. The propaganda extended into society, and newspapers ran stories praising the loyalty of women who served soldiers in brothels. One even referred to them as angels in the shadows. Imagine that. The same women who were shamed, locked up, spat on during peace were now treated as quiet heroines of the war effort. It didn't last, of course. As soon as the fighting ended, the angels were shoved back into the dirt. But for a brief moment, the Empire bent its moral code into a circle and called exploitation patriotic. You turn a corner and pass a tavern where a group of young men, fresh from the train station, are toasting to survival. They haven't seen the front yet. They still believe in glory. One of them sings an old song, off-key but loud, and the others join in, banging mugs against the table. Just behind them, near the back door, a girl no older than 20 lights a cigarette with shaking fingers. She's wearing rouge. Her eyes are already tired. You can guess what comes next. And then there's this. Some of the women bought into it. Not all, not most, but some. A few truly believed they were serving their country, that they were keeping men sane, alive, ready to fight. Others told themselves that because the client wore a uniform, it was somehow cleaner, safer, more meaningful, as if a bayonet could make you more honourable in bed. You pass another checkpoint now, 2 officers warming their hands over a small stove. One of them is joking about the girls in the barrack house using a nickname for one of the military-run brothels. It's not malicious, just casual, like discussing the weather. That's how deep it goes. When the state wraps exploitation in a flag, people stop seeing it for what it is. There's a long-standing debate among historians about whether this militarization of prostitution was intentional or just a byproduct of larger systems. Some argue it was a strategy. Others say it was an accident of necessity. But the records are clear. Someone made the call, someone approved the budget, someone printed the leaflets. And the women, they blared all the same. As you move away from the barracks, the noise fades behind you. But the echo of it, the laughter, the marching, the promises made and broken lingers in your ears. Somewhere, on some quiet battlefield, a man clutches a locket with a woman's picture inside. A woman who never gave consent to be part of the war effort. A woman who was told her body was a service. And here in the city, she's just trying to make rent. You find yourself now walking along a tree-lined boulevard, quieter than the rest, the kind of street where carriages roll slowly and the wind plays with scraps of newspaper that no one bothers to pick up. Everything here feels a little too neat. The buildings are prim, symmetrical, painted in soft colours that look less like real shades and more like someone's idea of calm. But beneath that surface, the same story simmers, just wrapped in velvet instead of burlap. You're approaching a place that claimed to be about healing, but which often did the opposite, the doctor's office. More specifically, you're walking into the cold clinical world of venereal disease control in the Russian Empire, a world where women were labelled, tested, confined and judged not by their symptoms, but by their status, where medicine wasn't just a science but a tool of the state, and the people holding the tools, often less interested in healing than in categorising the broken. The sign above the building is simple. Medical Office Number 3, Women's Division. No frills, no curtains in the windows. You step inside and the air turns immediately colder, despite the weak stove near the front desk. The walls are tiled in white, cracked at the corners. The paint peeling in strips like tired skin. A woman behind a counter barely looks up. She slides a logbook toward you, open to a page that's already smeared with 6 signatures. There's a line. There's always a line. This isn't the first time you've stood in a room like this, but it never stops feeling wrong. These places existed in nearly every major Russian city by the late 1800s. Government-run medical offices that operated under the reglementation system, a policy that required registered prostitutes to undergo mandatory health inspections, usually weekly, sometimes more, ostensibly to prevent the spread of venereal disease. In reality, it was one more form of control, one more cage dressed up as hygiene. You watch as a girl emerges from the exam room. She's young, her braid is loose, her cheeks flushed not from illness, but humiliation. She doesn't look at anyone. Just walks out quickly, holding a folded piece of paper in her hand, a certificate, the only thing standing between her and eviction from the brothel. You take her place in the queue and glance around. The women here all wear the same expression, somewhere between numbness and nausea. The older ones lean against the walls with folded arms. The younger ones try not to fidget. A few clutch handkerchiefs or the books, anything to keep their fingers from shaking. They've all been here before. They'll all be here again. The exam itself, let's not pretend, it was invasive, crude, sometimes degrading. Doctors, usually men, though occasionally women, conducted pelvic exams under poor lighting, with barely sterilised equipment, and rarely any consent. No one explained what was being done. No one asked permission. They were looking for signs of syphilis, gonorrhea, chancroid. If they found anything suspicious, you were tagged as infected and sent immediately to a special hospital. No negotiation, no chance to argue. Just an order, a file, and a bed waiting behind bars. What's wild is how inconsistent the system was. In some cities, women could be examined by private physicians, some of whom were sympathetic or at least discreet. In others, only state doctors were allowed, many of whom viewed their patients with thinly veiled contempt. There are medical reports from the time that read less like health evaluations and more like moral verdicts. One file describes a woman as unsanitary in spirit as in body. Another calls a girl repulsive in conduct, though compliant during procedure. You'd think they were writing theatre reviews, not treatment notes. And let's not forget, the men were almost never examined. The clients, the soldiers, the students, the bureaucrats. They weren't dragged into clinics, they weren't logged or labelled. If a man transmitted syphilis to a dozen women, he was considered unlucky. If a woman caught it once, she was considered dangerous. A vector of disease, the report said. A hazard to society. Never mind how she got infected. Never mind who gave it to her. The question was always, what will we do with her now? Which brings us to the hospitals. Venereal wards were scattered across Russia, some attached to public hospitals, others run as standalone asylums for infected women. They weren't places of care, they were places of punishment. Metal beds, barred windows, freezing hallways. Treatment included mercury injections, sulfur baths, and isolation. If you refused, they strapped you down. If you screamed, they made a note. Hysterical. Uncooperative. The treatment was rarely effective, often toxic, and almost never administered with kindness. A particularly disturbing case comes from a clinic in Yekaterinburg where a group of women were allegedly subjected to experimental treatments using arsenic without their consent and with no follow-up. At least 5 died within weeks. No investigation followed. The deaths were written off as progression of the disease. The experiment, we now know, was part of a larger study funded quietly by a medical university. You won't find their names on any memorial. And then there's the fringe side of all this, the so-called social medicine movement that tried to blend epidemiology with social engineering. These doctors didn't just treat disease, they tracked behaviour. They made charts, mapped brothel locations, wrote dissertations arguing that certain neighbourhoods produced more vice due to their architecture or the ethnicity of their residents. It was science twisted into surveillance, with the women's bodies as the unwitting data. You glance again at the logbook, open on the counter. The names are listed without flourish. First name, last name, registration number. Some crossed out, some underlined in red. You wonder what the red means. Maybe watch list, maybe repeat case. Maybe just someone having a bad day with a pen. There's one woman still in line whispering a prayer under her breath, knuckles white around the strap of her purse. She doesn't look sick, but she knows that doesn't matter. If the doctor thinks she is, she's going in, and there's no way to argue with a diagnosis made in ink. The door opens again, and another name is called. The line moves forward, and you realise this isn't medicine, this is management. This is the state poking and prodding, not to cure, but to control. The doctor is just another inspector. The diagnosis just another excuse to shuffle someone from one cage to the next. Outside, the rain has stopped. You step into the chill, cleaner air filling your lungs. Somewhere a woman's just been told she's unfit. Somewhere else a man leaves a brothel without ever knowing he carried anything at all, and in a clinic office a doctor stamps another form. Next. You didn't expect it to smell like cinnamon. But here you are, standing at the edge of a narrow basement stairwell in a part of Saint Petersburg that most people pretend doesn't exist, breathing in something warm, sweet, and faintly wrong. You hesitate for a second. Your boots slick on the stone steps, your ears catching faint music from somewhere below. A low, slow melody plucked from a balalaika, drifting through the cracks of the street like a secret trying not to be overheard. And just like that, you've left the world of brothels and bureaucracy behind. You're slipping now into the fringe, into the velvet-draped corners of the city where vice becomes something else entirely, where sex work bleeds into mysticism, opium, and the occult. A strange underworld where nothing is official and everything is negotiable, including reality. Down the stairs and through a bead curtain, you enter what might be a tea house, might be a den, might be a temple depending on who you ask. The ceiling is low, the walls are lined with red fabric, candles burn slowly in cut glass holders. In one corner a woman in dark robes leans over a table, reading cards for a man who sips tea from a porcelain cup with trembling hands. The air smells like burnt herbs, pipe smoke, and spiced honey. You've found the underbelly's underbelly, the part of the empire where the forbidden doesn't just hide, it performs. Places like this weren't everywhere, but they existed, in Saint Petersburg, in Moscow, in Odessa. Brothels that didn't just sell sex, but offered something more elusive, power, or at least the illusion of it. Women here weren't just workers, they were priestesses, mediums, fortune-tellers. They wore veils, carried charms, whispered spells. Some played the part to entertain, some believed it, and some blurred the line so completely it didn't matter anymore. You sit down at a low table and watch as another woman walks by in a long blue gown, a thick braid coiled around her neck like a rope. She doesn't make eye contact, she doesn't need to. Her presence alone is theatrical, other clients shift to make room for her. She's known here, maybe feared, maybe worshipped. You're not sure, you never get her name, and that's the point. These fringe brothels catered to a different kind of clientele. Artists, poets, minor nobles with strange hobbies. Men who didn't just want to buy a body, they wanted to buy experience, a performance, a moment of transformation. "Let her tell me I'm cursed," one client wrote in a hidden diary later uncovered by researchers. "Let her lift it with her hands." Another wrote of visiting a girl who claimed she could speak with the dead. He paid extra for her to conjure the spirit of his mother. Whether she succeeded, he didn't say. Some women here used laudanum, an opiate syrup mixed with alcohol, to blur the edges of their nights. Others smoked hashish or sipped hallucinogenic teas made from herbs they kept in little glass jars behind the curtains. One girl, it said, could read a man's future just by licking his palm and closing her eyes. A myth? Probably, but the stories persisted, and in the world they built, stories were currency. The empire's officials pretended places like this didn't exist. They were too messy, too mystical, too hard to document. You can't stamp a yellow ticket for priestess of forbidden memory. And what's more, they disrupted the state's neat little categories. Prostitute or wife, clean or unclean, sane or mad. These women were none of those things, or all of them at once, and so the system simply erased them. But the clients didn't forget. These dens were popular, especially during times of national crisis, when cholera swept through St. Petersburg. Visits to spiritual brothels actually increased. People wanted comfort, escape, healing, real or imagined. And the women who offered it did so with a theatrical flair that often disguised their own trauma. They wore costumes made of their own histories, told stories in candlelight that smelled like truth. And if they were high out of their minds, all the better. The lines blurred. One of the most famous houses like this, though it was never officially named, was said to be operated by a former noblewoman who lost everything in a failed marriage. She converted her estate's guest house into a temple of sorts, where every girl was trained in tarot, incense rituals, and erotic hypnosis. Clients came from as far as Warsaw. Rumours swirled that even minor members of the Romanov family visited, disguised beneath velvet hoods, seeking visions and release. There's no proof, but there's a letter in an old archive signed only with the initials N.A., praising Madame Savi's House of Revelation for its remedies for grief. Make of that what you will. Of course, not everyone came seeking healing. Some came for darker reasons. There are stories, disturbing ones, about occult rituals gone too far, about girls disappearing, about rituals involving blood, not just wine. You pass a wooden cabinet now with a faded iron lock and wonder what's inside. You hear something, a low moan, or maybe just wind against the walls. Either way, you don't open it. Some scholars dismiss all this as an exaggerated legend, romanticised in the decades after the empire's fall. They argue that mysticism was fashionable at the time, especially among the bored and elite, that these brothels were just elaborate games, role-play for jaded men. But others argue more convincingly that these spaces were real expressions of pain and power, that for some women, claiming the identity of a witch or oracle was a way of reclaiming control. If the world already treated them as dangerous or shameful, why not lean into the mask? Make it beautiful, make it feared. And maybe it worked, at least for a while. You rise from the table and make your way back toward the stairs, the smell of cinnamon clinging to your clothes. Behind you, someone begins to sing, low, wordless, haunting. A sound that doesn't belong in this century, maybe not in any. You don't look back. Outside, the night air hits you like truth. The rain has stopped, and the snow begins again, light, floating, impossible to catch. The city feels quieter here, as if holding its breath. You walk away slowly, unsure of what you just saw, or how much of it was real. But one thing is clear. Some women in the Russian Empire didn't just sell their bodies. They sold belief. You're walking now along the edge of a park, the trees bare and brittle, their skeletal limbs reaching into the grey sky like fingers still trying to grasp something already lost. The air feels a little cleaner here, a little quieter. But that's just the city pretending again. Pretending that the rot doesn't reach all the way into the libraries, the lecture halls, the poetry readings where men with wild beards and ink-stained cuffs speak of love and morality and revolution in the same breath. Because tonight, you're entering the most unexpected theatre of all, the pages of Russian literature. You wouldn't think it, standing here with your coat pulled tight and your breath fogging in front of your face, but some of the empire's most celebrated writers were obsessed with prostitutes. The fallen woman became one of the most recurring, tragic, mythologized figures in Russian fiction. A symbol, a metaphor, a walking wound, and almost always a plot device. You step into a small bookshop tucked behind a church, its windows fogged, the door creaking open into a warm, dusty room lined with more paper than floor. The man behind the counter barely glances at you. He's reading, of course, and you begin to browse. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Turgenev, names that ring like bells in the halls of world literature. But as you trace your fingers along the spines, you start to notice something else. The same names, the same archetype, again and again. There she is, Sonia Marmeladova, pale, meek, and trembling in the candlelight of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. A prostitute not out of desire, but necessity. A martyr figure. A saint in rags. She sacrifices herself for her family, forgives her tormentors, and becomes the moral compass for Raskolnikov, the tortured murderer she inexplicably falls in love with. The novel asks you to pity her, to admire her, but rarely, if ever, does it ask you to listen to her. She doesn't drive the story, she redeems someone else's. And that's the thing, most of these women were never really people in the eyes of the writers. They were ideas, devices, symbols of grace or ruin. They died tragically or were redeemed by a man's love or faded quietly into the snow, remembered not for what they endured, but for what they made someone else feel. Flip a few pages over to Tolstoy. No surprise, he too couldn't resist the tragic prostitute. In his short story Kreutzer Sonata, we're given a narrator so consumed by jealousy and moral outrage that the female character becomes little more than a canvas for his neuroses. When Tolstoy did write about sex work more directly, as in his lesser-known story After the Ball, it was filtered through his obsession with spiritual purity and sexual guilt. The prostitute wasn't just fallen, she was fallen for a reason, and that reason almost always pointed back to male sin or social decay. Even Chekhov, who was more subtle, more human in his storytelling, couldn't resist the trope. In The Chorus Girl, we meet a woman ridiculed, abandoned, emotionally dissected by the man who once desired her. She is, as always, the wound on which someone else's crisis is stitched. Some scholars argue that these writers were trying to provoke sympathy, that by writing about prostitutes with tenderness, they were subverting society's judgment, that Sonia's saintliness was meant to elevate the moral compass of the reader. But let's be honest, how helpful is sympathy when it's wrapped in fantasy? How revolutionary is pity when the woman never speaks her own truth? There's a particularly strange footnote in the diary of Turgenev, who once wrote about a young prostitute he encountered during his travels. He described her as delicate and unknowing of her own beauty, and wrote that he gave her money not for sex, but simply to preserve her light, whatever that means. He never mentioned her name, and that's the pattern. The literature of the Russian Empire used prostitutes the way painters use shadow, to draw attention to the light. These women were meant to suffer beautifully, to be contrasted against virtue, to give men something to regret, or rescue, or both. It wasn't just the serious writers either. Popular fiction was littered with these figures, often in far crueler forms. The vampire type, the seductress, the opium-smoking courtesan who led men into ruin, always archetypes, never people. And yet these stories shaped how society saw them. Literature was culture, and culture shaped law, judgment, and memory. A man who read about Sonia in Crime and Punishment might leave his brothel visit that night, feeling strangely noble, as though he'd been part of something romantic, tragic even. You pass by a stack of old journals on the counter, Russkaya Missal, Vestnik Evropy. Literary periodicals that once debated the ethics of fictionalizing fallen women. Some argued it brought awareness, others warned it glamorized vice. No one seemed to ask what the real women thought. You wonder if they even read these stories. If any brothel girl ever sat with her skirt hiked up reading about Sonia Marmeladova and thinking, if only the writer knew what it really felt like to be me. There is, however, one rare voice that stands apart. Vera Figner, a revolutionary and writer who penned her memoirs not as fiction, but as fact. She spoke of women forced into prostitution by the empire's brutality. She didn't romanticize them. She didn't redeem them. She described them as workers, survivors, victims of a system that used them and blamed them all at once. Her words didn't sell well. Too honest, too angry, but they're still there, tucked in the corners of the archives, waiting. Outside, the sun is beginning to rise again, pink and orange spilling into the cracks of the city like colour returning to a black and white photograph. You leave the bookshop, your coat heavier somehow, and pass a man sitting on a bench with a novel in his lap. His face is drawn and you catch the title, Anna Karenina, another woman destroyed by society and desire. Another tragic ending. You wonder if anyone ever wrote a story where she lives, where she gets out, where she laughs, grows old, opens a bakery, writes poetry, names her dog after a Tsar. But no, they only wrote her bleeding, because in Russian literature, she was never the author of her story, just the ink. The city is stirring now, horses clopping down slick cobblestone streets, delivery boys shouting half-heartedly as they balance crates on their shoulders, and somewhere in the distance a factory whistle shrieks through the morning chill like a metal bird losing its mind. The snow has crusted over into slush, grey at the edges and peppered with ash from a dozen chimneys. It's another day, and for many women in the city that means stepping back into a world that doesn't just tolerate prostitution, it depends on it. But today you're heading out of the capital. Not far, just a little east where the little noise starts to fade and the factories give way to frostbitten farmland. You're chasing the root of it all now, the first step in the chain. Because long before she wears the yellow ticket, before she walks the city streets with makeup smudged and eyes downcast, the story of the prostitute in the Russian Empire often begins in the village. And if you're imagining something rustic and cosy, please don't. This is not a Tolstoyan meadow of innocence. This is mud up to your ankles, smoke-choked huts, families packed 10 to a room, and a general sense that survival is a group project you're already behind on. You walk through one such village now, wooden houses leaning slightly from the weight of too many winters, chickens pecking near frozen puddles, and a girl about 13 carrying a bundle of firewood that's clearly half her size. She doesn't look up, none of them do, not when they're used to people arriving only to take something away. And here's the thing, poverty didn't just push girls toward prostitution, it shoved them without ceremony into a system that was already waiting with open arms and empty beds. A bad harvest meant the difference between a daughter staying home or being sold off to a placement agent. A sick father meant debt. Debt meant quick cash. And quick cash meant one less mouth to feed, and one girl gone to the city with promises stitched into her head like ribbon. A job as a maid, maybe. A seamstress. A waitress. All lies. You pass an old woman sitting on a wooden stoop peeling potatoes. She glances up just long enough to watch you go, then returns to her work. She's seen it before. Maybe she sent one of her daughters away years ago, telling herself it was just for a season, that she'd write, that she'd come home with money and new shoes and stories, but most of them didn't write. And those who did, well, the letters rarely said what the parents wanted to hear. There was a whole network built around these rural to urban transitions. Labour recruiters, they were called officially, though most operated under fake names with fake credentials and real greasy smiles. They'd visit villages under the guise of finding good girls for respectable homes in Moscow or Saint Petersburg. Sometimes they brought letters from supposed employers, sometimes they just showed up after a funeral or a failed harvest or when the tax collector came knocking. The village girls, uneducated, desperate and often isolated, were easy prey. And yes, not every girl who left the countryside ended up in a brothel. Some genuinely did find domestic work, some married into modest households, but many, far too many, stepped off the train into a city they couldn't navigate, were taken to boarding houses that were really holding centres, stripped of identification, and given a name that wasn't theirs. Within days they were registered, inspected, and settled into the life. If they tried to run, the police brought them back. The ticket once issued, was nearly impossible to revoke. There's a haunting detail in one police report from 1889. A girl from a village near Pskov, just 16, taken to Saint Petersburg by a man promising work as a shop assistant. When the brothel raid finally uncovered her 2 years later, she was barely recognisable. Her original name wasn't even listed in the registry. The madam had given her a new one. Her old self disappeared. And still, the village continued. Another winter, another set of debts, another girl on a train. There's a twisted irony in how the empire handled rural migration. Officials wrung their hands over urban overcrowding, yet actively encouraged the labour flow, because frankly the cities needed servants, seamstresses, laundresses, and yes, sex workers. The brothel industry was one more pressure valve, quietly siphoning away the overflow from a rural economy that couldn't sustain its population. And the government never had to get its hands dirty. It just watched from a distance, nodding politely while the system fed itself. Occasionally newspapers ran hand-wringing stories about country girls lost to the city, but the tone was always the same, tragedy dressed in condescension, as if the girl were simply too simple-minded to resist temptation, as if she tripped and fell into the brothel. No one asked how the recruiters got into the villages. No one questioned the authorities who processed her registration without blinking. But here's something you won't find in most textbooks. In some cases, villagers knew exactly what was happening, and still they let their daughters go, because the money she might send home could mean a new plough, a warm coat for her little brother, or one less night without dinner. One woman, interviewed decades later, recalled her mother telling her, "Don't tell me what you do in the city, just send something for your sister's medicine." There was shame, yes, but also survival. And in that calculation, morality didn't always win. You pause near the village church, small, wooden, its doors closed against the cold. Inside, a priest is likely giving the same sermon he gave last Sunday. Sin, obedience, God's mercy for the pure. But outside, his flock walks home past empty cradles and unsent letters, pretending not to see what's missing. Pretending they didn't trade their daughters for silence and bread. As the sun finally breaks through the clouds above, you realise how far this system reached. The brothel door wasn't just opened by a corrupt officer or a predatory madam. It was opened long before, on a farm with no harvest, in a house with no heat, by a mother with no options. And once the girl was gone, the village just waited for the next knock at the door. The snow has returned lightly this time, soft flakes drifting through the air like feathers from some invisible bird shaking itself awake above the rooftop. You're back in the city, back in Saint Petersburg, and the streets are slick again with slush and smoke. But this time you're not here to watch the girls work or follow a client or hover in the corners of clinics. Tonight you're looking upward, towards something less predictable, something more dangerous to the machine. Tonight you're meeting the women who resisted, and no, not in the loud, dramatic way you might expect. There were no parades, no megaphones, no grand speeches shouted from brothel balconies. Most of the resistance was quiet, unnoticed, a tilt of the head, a lie told carefully, a secret scrawled on a scrap of paper and slid beneath a locked door. But make no mistake, resistance was there, and it took 100 different forms. You duck into a narrow hallway behind an old apothecary, its front sign so faded it could just as easily say poison as powder. Inside it smells of licorice root and ink. This was once the meeting place of a women's literacy group, an unofficial one of course, because the empire wasn't exactly enthusiastic about poor women learning how to read. But someone had smuggled in books, a few pamphlets, a typewriter, and here, behind closed doors, women taught each other to write their names, to read a newspaper, to recognise the legal phrases printed on their yellow tickets. It doesn't sound like much, does it? But consider this. For a woman whose entire identity was reduced to a number in a registry, learning to read her own file was a radical act. Understanding the medical notes scribbled by indifferent doctors, recognising the laws she was supposedly protected or crushed by. That changed things. Even just knowing what was written about her in ink gave her something back. Language is a kind of armour, and these women were, slowly, stitching together their shields. One woman in particular stands out in the archives. Her name was Yulia Alexieva, and she had once worked as a clerk in a provincial post office before a scandal, the nature of which was suspiciously vague, forced her out of employment and into a brothel in Moscow. But she didn't stay quiet. She kept a journal. She tracked her clients. She documented how many of them were government employees, what they said, how they paid, what they expected. She wrote in careful looping Cyrillic, If I must be numbered, I will number them too. Yulia's journal survived because she mailed it, piece by piece, to a cousin who worked as a typesetter. Decades later, it was found hidden in a stack of discarded printing drafts. We don't know what happened to Yulia, but the pages are real. They burn with restrained fury. And she wasn't alone. There were brothel girls who staged quiet walkouts. Not strikes exactly, but vanishings. Women who, after months of planning, disappeared together in the middle of the night, changing names, changing cities, sometimes pretending to be married just to shed the yellow ticket. It was risky. Getting caught meant being dragged back, fined, sometimes imprisoned. But some succeeded. The records show occasional sudden removals from the registry, unexplained and clearly forced, but gone nonetheless. Then there were the small rebellions, the day-to-day subversions, refusing a client even if the madam insisted. Hiding coins under floorboards, wearing a dress you weren't assigned. One girl, known only by the nickname Mishka, carved the word free into the underside of a table in her brothel's waiting room. Not visible to the men, but the other girls saw it, touched it, carried it with them like a secret spell. Some women banded together informally, not unions exactly, but support groups. They shared food, watched out for the drunker clients, helped each other get to the clinic safely. And when one girl got sick, they pooled their coins for medicine before the brothel could send her away. There's one record of a group of women in Odessa who took turns reading to each other at night, from smuggled novels, from banned political tracts, even from old fairy tales. The reading itself was illegal, but the empire didn't have enough eyes to see everything. And not all resistance came from within. There were outside allies, journalists, nurses, teachers, who risked careers and jail time trying to expose what was happening behind the state's polished walls. Some wrote anonymous columns in liberal newspapers, describing the inspection rooms, the brutality of the hospitals, the humiliation of the women forced into submission every week. One nurse wrote under the pseudonym Lyubov S., documenting what she saw in the venereal wards. Her final published article ended with a line that caused more than one censor to choke on his tea. The disease is not in their blood, it is in the law. Of course, not all these efforts succeeded. Many women were caught, punished, silenced. A few simply disappeared. Whether to the provinces or the prisons, no one knows, but each act of rebellion chipped away at the lie that they were passive, that they had no thoughts beyond payment, no desires beyond escape. Resistance, even when it fails, is proof of agency. There's an open debate among modern historians. Were these women proto-feminists? Were they political actors or simply trying to survive? The answers vary depending on who you ask. But what's undeniable is that they were not powerless. The system tried to make them invisible, but they scratched messages into door frames, folded coins into coat linings, whispered their real names to each other, in the dark. You exit the old apothecary building and step back into the street. A woman in a fur-trimmed coat walks past you, her heels sharp against the stone, her chin lifted in a way that says she owes the world nothing. Maybe she's just a passerby, or maybe she's part of something bigger, a lineage of quiet defiance stretching back through decades of silence. The snow swirls, the lamplight flickers, and you realise something. For every law written to control them, a woman rewrote her story in secret. For every door that locked behind them, they found another one to wedge open with whatever they had left. They weren't just bodies, they were sparks. You find yourself tonight in a room filled with mirrors, not real ones, not silvered glass or polished metal, but the kind that stare back at you from people's eyes. Reflections shaped by stories, rumours, sighs behind fans, jokes in taverns, raised eyebrows at dinner parties. You're walking through the social gaze now, the one that followed prostitutes through every public space in the Russian Empire. It didn't matter where she stood, on a corner, in a market, in line at a bakery. She was seen, she was known, and she was never allowed to forget it. Welcome to the empire of shame. Shame in Russia wasn't just personal, it was institutional. It was printed on paper, stamped with ink, signed by officials who'd never once spoken to the women they labelled. You feel that shame now as you stand in a government registry office. Fluorescent light bleeding into dusty corners, file drawers stuffed with names and numbers and thin little histories. This is where the yellow ticket lived. It wasn't just a card, it was a passport to humiliation, a signal flare, a curse written in administrative language. Once you held that ticket, you couldn't rent a flat without scrutiny. You couldn't walk into a church without stares. You couldn't go to the doctor without being asked that question, do you have your papers? It followed you into the bakery, into the bathhouse, into the very way people looked at your hands. Even if you dressed modestly, even if you were off-duty, the ticket talked. And let's not pretend the public didn't know what it meant. Everyone knew. Middle-class matrons whispered about those girls when one walked too close to their market stall. Children were told not to look. And men, well, men might use them at night, then pretend that they didn't exist by morning. Or worse, they'd see them again in daylight and spit. There's a particularly telling entry in a magistrate's diary, written sometime in the 1880s, where he describes watching a woman with a yellow ticket attempt to buy a pair of gloves at a market. The merchant refused. Not loudly, just enough. Enough to show that everyone knew what she was. He wrote, "She stood quietly and left without speaking. The people admired her sternness, as if she'd understood her place." Admirable sentence, think about that. But some women fought against the shame in subtle ways. They wore perfume that was too expensive, walked too confidently, took public trams during peak hours. One even tried to enroll in night school, though she was quickly turned away once her status came out. Another girl had a custom locket made with a false monogram, a fake noble name. She wore it every day. Just to be looked at differently, just to pretend. Of course, the social stigma wasn't reserved for the women alone. The men who consorted with prostitutes, at least when they were caught, faced their own brand of shame. But it was usually painted over with humour, brushed off with winks and jokes and the age-old phrase, "boys will be boys." A man caught frequenting brothels might lose face, but never livelihood. Never his name. The woman? She lost everything. Even the right to call herself decent. You walk now into a small tea room tucked into a row of crumbling buildings. It's warm inside, cosy. You might almost believe this was a safe place, but in the far corner sits a woman alone, her eyes fixed on her cup, shoulders hunched like she's trying to fold herself smaller. The other tables glance at her. Once, twice. That's all it takes. One of them whispers to the waitress. A moment later, she's asked to leave. No cause given. She doesn't argue. Just slides her coat on and walks out into the snow. That's how stigma worked. Quietly, efficiently, no scene, just exile by 1,000 glances. Even reformers, those who claim to champion these women, often did so with built-in judgment. We must save them, they said, from themselves. They wrote pamphlets with titles like The Fallen Angel and When Innocence Turns to Vice. They meant well, truly, but their language did more harm than they knew. Always fallen, never pushed. Always a moral decline, never an economic reality. And then, of course, there were the brothel owners, the madams, the landlords, the silent investors who walked among polite society like any other entrepreneur. Many lived in respectable neighbourhoods, sent their children to good schools, dined at restaurants that wouldn't even seat the women who made them rich. The contradiction was everywhere. The hand that feeds shaming the mouth it fed. There's an open question among historians, one that still sparks debate in academic circles. Was the social stigma deliberately cultivated by the state to maintain control, a built-in deterrent, reinforced not with laws but with looks? Some argue yes, that the system relied on shame to keep women from demanding more, from speaking out, from organising. Others argue that it was organic, born from deep-seated cultural attitudes about women, purity and power. But in practice it didn't matter. The result was the same. You pass a statue in the square now, an angel, wings spread, eyes cast downward. It was meant to symbolise mercy, but tonight, under the snow and soot, it looks like something else entirely. Not compassion, not grease, judgment. Back in the street, you watch as a girl walks past a bakery. She doesn't go in, just lingers near the window for a moment, watching people eat what she probably can't afford. She's dressed neatly, hair pinned, gloves clean, but still, someone looks at her too long. A moment passes, she walks on, and you wonder, how much of her calence is survival? How much of it is exhaustion? Because shame is heavy, but worse, it's sticky. You can't wash it off. You can't leave it at home. You wear it, in the slope of your shoulders, in how you fold your hands, in how you never let yourself sit too long anywhere someone might recognise you. And still, they endured. They smiled, they laughed in private, they sent money home. They kissed clients on the cheek like they meant it. They put on nice shoes, even if they hurt. They refused to vanish. The mirrors may have been cruel, but they never showed the whole picture. Not even close. You've come to the edge now, the edge of the story, the edge of an empire. The lamps are still lit, the snow still falls, but the sky feels different. Charged, brittle, ready to crack open, and it will. Because tonight the streets whisper a new word. Revolution. It's 1917. The Romanovs are stumbling, the factories are rioting, the soldiers are deserting, and the brothels? Still open, still operating, still grinding women down like flour beneath a wheel. But not for long, the storm is coming. And when it hits, even the oldest walls will fall. You're walking through Petrograd now, Saint Petersburg reborn with a more urgent name. The signs on the shops are fading, half torn down. There's more red in the windows. Red flags, red banners. Red graffiti scrawled in charcoal on the bricks, peace, land, bread, and sometimes below it, in a different hand, freedom for all women. You don't know who wrote that. But it wasn't just a slogan, it was a warning. Because while politicians and revolutionaries argued about workers' rights and class equality, there were women in brothels watching with weary eyes, wondering what this would mean for them. Would the revolution see them? Would it clean the slate? Or just repaint it in red and pretend it was something new? Inside the brothels, the air is different. Tense. Some clients have stopped coming, some have joined militias, others still visit, but leave faster, more nervous. The madams are panicked, business is down. Rumours swirl that the Bolsheviks plan to shut the whole system down. Some say they'll legalize everything instead, no one agrees. And meanwhile, the women keep working, keep breathing, keep waiting, and then it happens. A decree. It's December 1917, barely a month after the Bolsheviks seize power. Lenin signs off on the formal abolition of prostitution as a legal institution. Just like that, the yellow tickets are void. The registry's closed, the brothels technically illegal. One flick of the pen, and the entire massive machinery you've followed for the last 30 sections is outlawed. Freedom, right? Sure. On paper. In reality, it was chaos. The system didn't disappear, it just changed shape. Legal brothels shuttered overnight, some with women still inside. Madams fled, landlords tore down signage, police officers torched files, and the women? Most were simply pushed from one form of survival to another. Some went underground, continuing to work in secret, dodging arrests. Some tried factory work, only to find the wages even lower and the harassment just as brutal. A few managed to escape entirely, marry, relocate, hide in the countryside. But for many, it was just the same job in worse conditions, no oversight, no protection, no rights. The Bolsheviks, for their part, tried to manage the fallout. They created rehabilitation homes for former prostitutes, safe havens meant to offer food, education, employment. But the funding ran out quickly, the staff was untrained, and the women, traumatized and often addicted or sick, didn't always fit the revolutionary mold of the new Soviet woman. You can't re-educate someone by pretending her past never happened. One such home, documented in a 1920 report, was overrun within weeks. 22 women, 3 beds, 1 staff member, no heat. It closed within the year. Still, the revolution moved on, and so did the history books, because here's the cruel twist. The prostitutes of the Russian Empire, women who had been catalogued, examined, jailed and judged, were suddenly erased. Not honoured, not helped, just removed. The Soviet narrative didn't have space for them. You were either a heroic worker or a capitalist parasite. And a woman who sold her body for survival? Too complicated, too messy, too real. You pass a library now, newly rebranded as the People's Reading Hall. Inside, rows of new Soviet pamphlets line the walls. Not a single one mentions prostitution. Not a single one explains where all those women went. The entire apparatus of yellow tickets, police inspections, medical exams, and state-sanctioned brothels was scrubbed from memory like a smudge on Lenin's glasses. And yet, they left traces, in archives, in whispered stories, in records with names blacked out but ages still visible. Maria, 16. Anna, 34. Zinaida, unknown. In crumbling brothel buildings converted into housing blocks, their walls still smelling faintly of perfume and ash. In oral histories collected by brave researchers decades later, fragments of memory held together with cigarette burns and silence. You walk now through one of those converted buildings. A young mother hurries past you with a crying child. A man leans out a window, smoking and watching the snowfall. No one knows what this place used to be. Or maybe they do and they just don't say. The past is a heavy coat in Russia. People wear it without talking about it. There's a rusted plaque on the wall. Almost unreadable. It says, "This building served the people." No date, no context. and you realise something simple, something sharp. Most of the women who lived and died in this system were never even named in print. They were known by numbers, by registry codes, by whispered descriptions in police reports. Dark hair, 5'2", compliant. They were archived but never remembered. They were recorded but never heard. History logged their symptoms, not their stories, and yet you've followed them. You've walked their streets, seen their clinics, heard their songs, touched the frayed pages of their lives. You've seen how they were turned into currency, into cautionary tales, into ghosts, and now you carry them forward. Because maybe remembering is its own kind of revolution. So now you're here, at the end of the street, the end of the empire, the end of this long, winding story told in candlelight and footsteps. You can feel it, something different in the air. Not resolution exactly, but a kind of stillness, a curtain pulled slowly shut, not because the show's over, but because no one ever really wanted to see it to begin with. You take one last look over your shoulder. The brothels are shuttered, the yellow tickets burned or buried in forgotten drawers, the women scattered, some vanished, some surviving, some remembered only by the space they left behind. Their names, when you find them, feel like whispers caught between pages. They never asked to become symbols, but they were made into them, over and over again. And the truth, the hard, unpretty, quietly shattering truth, is that this wasn't just a story about prostitution. It was a story about power, about who gets to write the rules and who gets written out, about how a woman's body can be turned into law, into labour, into punishment, into prayer, and how she might still somehow walk out the door in the morning and keep going, laugh, breathe, love someone, write her name on a scrap of paper, and hide it in her coat pocket like a secret waiting to be told. Now it's yours. You've walked the halls, you've read the files, you've watched history blink past in lamplight. So take a breath, let it settle, dim the lights, maybe turn on that fan again for that soft background hum. And as you drift off tonight, just remember there were thousands of them, and every single one deserved more than just a footnote.